Hello and welcome. Today, I will be whispering to you about the Second World War, the prelude to World War II, the interwar period, and the rise of totalitarianism. The period between the two world wars, often referred to as the interwar period, was marked by significant political, social, and economic upheaval. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended World War I but left many issues unresolved. The harsh terms imposed on Germany, including substantial reparations, territorial losses, and military restrictions, created deep resentment and a desire for revenge among the German populace. During the 1920s, the world saw a brief period of recovery and relative stability. The Roaring Twenties were characterized by economic prosperity, cultural flourishing, and technological advancements, particularly in the United States and parts of Europe. However, this prosperity was not universal, and many countries, including Germany, continued to struggle with economic difficulties and political instability. The Wall Street crash of 1929 marked the beginning of the Great Depression, a severe worldwide economic downturn that lasted throughout the 1930s. Unemployment skyrocketed, banks failed, and industrial output plummeted. The economic crisis had profound political implications, leading to widespread disillusionment with democratic governments and the rise of extremist political movements. In Germany, the Weimar Republic, established after World War I, struggled to maintain stability. The Great Depression exacerbated the country's economic woes, and political extremism gained ground. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, exploited this situation by promising to restore Germany's former glory, revitalize the economy, and provide jobs. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, and he quickly moved to consolidate power and establish a totalitarian regime. Hitler's vision of a greater Germany involved the unification of all German-speaking peoples, territorial expansion, and the establishment of a racially pure state. His aggressive foreign policy included the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, known as the Anschluss, and the acquisition of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia later that year. These actions were met with little resistance from other European powers, who were wary of another conflict and hoped to appease Hitler through diplomatic means. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime, established in 1922, sought to create a new Roman Empire. Mussolini's ambitions included territorial expansion in Africa and the Mediterranean. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, an act that was condemned by the League of Nations but resulted in limited punitive measures. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin had consolidated power by the late 1920s and embarked on a series of brutal purges and forced collectivization policies. Stalin's regime sought to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial power, but at the cost of millions of lives due to famine, forced labor, and political repression. Japan, experiencing rapid industrialization and modernization since the late 19th century, also pursued an expansionist policy. The need for raw materials and living space drove Japan to invade Manchuria in 1931 and later China in 1937. These actions were part of Japan's broader strategy to establish dominance in East Asia. As these totalitarian regimes pursued their aggressive policies, the democratic nations of Europe and North America were preoccupied with their own economic problems and internal political issues. The policy of appeasement, most notably championed by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, sought to avoid war by making concessions to the aggressor nations. This approach ultimately failed, as it only emboldened Hitler and other dictators to further their expansionist aims. The stage was set for a global conflict. The world was on the brink of a war that would surpass the devastation of the First World War and reshape the political landscape of the 20th century. The rise of totalitarian regimes and the collapse of diplomacy. The rise of totalitarian regimes in the interwar period was a key factor in the lead-up to World War II. The political landscape of Europe and Asia was increasingly dominated by aggressive, expansionist powers, setting the stage for a conflict that would engulf the globe. The Nazi regime and Hitler's expansionist policies. Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany was a turning point. After becoming Chancellor in 1933, Hitler quickly established a dictatorship, consolidating power through the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act. The Nazi regime systematically dismantled democratic institutions and persecuted political opponents, Jews, and other minorities. Propaganda played a significant role in solidifying Hitler's grip on power, with Joseph Goebbels orchestrating a relentless campaign to indoctrinate the German population. Hitler's foreign policy was driven by the concept of Lebensraum, living space, which aimed to expand German territory to provide space for the Aryan race to grow. This ideology justified the aggressive expansion that followed. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, violating the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Treaties. The lack of military response from France and Britain emboldened Hitler. The Anschluss in March 1938 was a significant step in Hitler's expansionist agenda. German troops marched into Austria without facing resistance, and Austria was annexed to Germany. The Munich Agreement in September 1938, which permitted the annexation of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, was another critical moment. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, hoping to avoid war, famously declared that the agreement would bring peace for our time. However, this policy of appeasement only encouraged further aggression from Hitler. In March 1939, Hitler violated the Munich Agreement by occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia. This blatant act of aggression demonstrated the futility of appeasement and shifted public opinion in Britain and France towards a more confrontational stance. The invasion of Poland was now seen as imminent, leading to increased military preparations. Italy and Mussolini's imperial ambitions. Benito Mussolini's Italy also pursued an aggressive foreign policy. Mussolini aimed to revive the glory of the Roman Empire and establish Italy as a dominant power in the Mediterranean and Africa. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, despite international condemnation and economic sanctions by the League of Nations, showcased Italy's expansionist ambitions. The lack of decisive action from other powers emboldened Mussolini. The Rome-Berlin Axis, formalized in 1936, created a military and political alliance between Italy and Germany. This alliance further destabilized Europe, as it brought together two aggressive totalitarian states with expansionist ambitions. Mussolini's support for Hitler's policies, including the Anschluss and the occupation of Czechoslovakia, strengthened the bond between the two dictators. Japan's expansion in Asia. In Asia, Japan pursued its own expansionist agenda. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 marked the beginning of Japan's imperialist campaign. The establishment of the puppet state of Manchukuo demonstrated Japan's willingness to use military force to achieve its objectives. The invasion of China in 1937 led to the brutal Second Sino-Japanese War, characterized by atrocities such as the Nanking Massacre. Japan's expansion was driven by a desire for natural resources and strategic territories to support its growing industrial economy. The military leadership, particularly the Guandong Army, played a significant role in shaping Japan's aggressive foreign policy. The failure of diplomatic efforts and the lack of a unified response from Western powers allowed Japan to continue its conquests in Asia. The failure of the League of Nations and diplomatic efforts. The League of Nations, established after World War I to maintain peace and prevent conflicts, proved ineffective in the face of aggressive actions by Germany, Italy, and Japan. The League's inability to enforce its resolutions and the lack of military power undermined its credibility. Key powers, including the United States, were not members, further weakening the organization. Efforts to achieve disarmament and collective security were unsuccessful. The Disarmament Conference of 1932 to 1934 failed to produce meaningful results, and the concept of collective security was undermined by the unwillingness of member states to commit to military action against aggressors. The policy of appeasement, pursued primarily by Britain and France, aimed to avoid war but ultimately failed to prevent it. The Non-Aggression Pact and the Road to War. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939 between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was a shocking development. The Non-Aggression Pact included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, paving the way for the invasion of Poland. This agreement ensured that Germany would not face a two-front war, clearing the path for Hitler's invasion plans. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, using blitzkrieg tactics to overwhelm Polish defenses. Britain and France, honoring their commitments to Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. The invasion of Poland marked the beginning of World War II, a conflict that would become the deadliest and most widespread in human history. The invasion of Poland, the Blitzkrieg unleashed. On September 1, 1939, the German Wehrmacht launched a devastating and swift invasion of Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. This military campaign, known as Blitzkrieg or Lightning War, was characterized by rapid movements, concentrated firepower, and the use of combined arms, including tanks, infantry, and aircraft, to achieve quick and decisive victories. The strategic objectives. Hitler's strategic objectives for the invasion of Poland were clear: to quickly crush Polish resistance, secure German territorial gains, and create a buffer zone against the Soviet Union. The invasion plan, codenamed Fallweiss, Case White, involved a pincer movement with two main thrusts. One thrust, led by Army Group North under General Fedor von Bock, would advance from East Prussia and Pomerania towards Warsaw. The other, Army Group South under General Gerd von Rundstedt, would push from Silesia and Slovakia towards the Polish capital. The attack begins. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border, and the Luftwaffe began bombing Polish cities, airfields, and military installations. The attack was swift and overwhelming, catching the Polish forces off guard. The Luftwaffe's bombers and fighters established air superiority within the first few days, crippling the Polish Air Force and disrupting communication and transportation networks. The German panzer divisions, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery, spearheaded the advance. These armored units quickly penetrated deep into Polish territory, bypassing strong points and encircling large formations of Polish troops. The speed and coordination of the German attack left the Polish defenses in disarray. The fall of Warsaw. As German forces advanced, they encountered fierce resistance from the Polish army. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Polish soldiers fought bravely to defend their homeland. The Battle of Bzura, fought between September 9th and September 19th, 1939, was the largest and most significant Polish counteroffensive. Although initially successful, the Polish forces were eventually encircled and defeated by the Germans. By mid-September, German forces had encircled Warsaw. The city faced relentless bombing and artillery barrages, causing widespread destruction and civilian casualties. Despite the dire situation, the defenders of Warsaw held out, hoping for relief from the Allies. However, on September 17, 1939, the situation worsened as the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, following the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. With the Red Army advancing from the east and German forces tightening the noose around Warsaw, the Polish government fled to Romania. On September 27, 1939, after weeks of brutal fighting, Warsaw capitulated to the Germans. The fall of Warsaw marked the end of organized Polish resistance, and by early October, the last pockets of Polish troops had surrendered or been defeated. The aftermath and division of Poland. The conquest of Poland was completed in less than 5 weeks, a testament to the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics. The German and Soviet invaders quickly moved to consolidate their control over the occupied territories. Poland was divided according to the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with Germany annexing the western and central parts and the Soviet Union taking the eastern regions. The German occupation of Poland was marked by brutal repression and atrocities. The Nazi regime implemented policies of terror aimed at crushing any potential resistance and eliminating the Polish intelligentsia. The establishment of ghettos and concentration camps began, setting the stage for the horrific crimes of the Holocaust. The Soviet occupation in the East was also harsh. The Red Army and NKVD, Soviet secret police, arrested and deported hundreds of thousands of Poles to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions. The Katyn massacre, in which thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals were executed by the Soviets, was one of the most notorious atrocities committed during this period. The Phony War and the Winter War. With the fall of Poland, Europe entered a period known as the Phony War, Sitzkrieg, lasting from October 1939 to April 1940. Despite the declarations of war by Britain and France, there was little active combat on the Western Front. Both sides spent this time building up their forces and fortifications, preparing for the inevitable conflict to come. During this period, the Soviet Union pursued its own aggressive expansionist policies. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, starting the Winter War. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the Finnish forces mounted a determined defense, using guerrilla tactics and their knowledge of the harsh winter terrain to inflict significant casualties on the Soviet invaders. The war ended in March 1940 with the Moscow Peace Treaty, which ceded substantial Finnish territory to the Soviet Union but preserved Finnish independence. Preparing for the next phase. As 1939 turned into 1940, the stage was set for a broader conflict. The initial successes of the Axis powers, particularly Germany, highlighted the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics and the weaknesses in the existing defensive strategies of the Allies. The Phony War provided a brief respite but also a critical period for both sides to regroup, rearm, and prepare for the next phase of the war. Consolidation of power in Poland. Following the swift and decisive invasion of Poland, Germany and the Soviet Union moved quickly to consolidate their respective gains. In the German-occupied western and central parts of Poland, the Nazi regime implemented a brutal occupation policy. The Polish state was dismantled, and the region was divided into the Reichsgau Wutherland, Danzig West Prussia, and the general government. These areas were directly incorporated into the Third Reich or administered as German-controlled territories. The German occupation authorities embarked on a campaign of terror to suppress any potential resistance. Intellectuals, political leaders, and members of the clergy were targeted for arrest, execution, or deportation to concentration camps. The goal was to decapitate Polish society and eliminate any sources of leadership that could organize opposition. In addition to political repression, the Nazis began the systematic persecution of Jews and other minority groups. Ghettos were established in cities like Warsaw, Lodz, and Krakow, where Jewish populations were forcibly confined in appalling conditions. This marked the beginning of the Holocaust, which would later see the mass extermination of Jews in death camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. In the Soviet-occupied eastern regions, the Red Army and NKVD carried out their own campaign of terror. Tens of thousands of Poles, including military officers, policemen, and members of the intelligentsia, were arrested and deported to gulags in Siberia and Kazakhstan. The Katyn massacre, where over 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals were executed by the Soviets in the spring of 1940, was a particularly heinous act of brutality. The Phony War, a period of uncertainty. While the horrors of the Polish occupation unfolded, Western Europe experienced a period of relative calm known as the Phony War, Sitzkrieg. Despite the declarations of war by Britain and France following the invasion of Poland, there was little actual combat on the Western Front. Both sides used this time to build up their military forces and prepare for the next phase of the conflict. The Allies, particularly France, relied heavily on the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications along the French-German border, believing it would provide a strong defensive barrier against a German attack. However, this defensive posture proved to be a strategic miscalculation, as the German military planners were already devising plans to bypass these fortifications through Belgium and the Ardennes. During the Phony War, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was deployed to France, and both British and French forces undertook various defensive preparations. However, there was a growing sense of unease and anticipation as it became clear that the initial period of inactivity would not last. The Winter War, Soviet expansionism. While Western Europe remained relatively quiet, the Soviet Union pursued its own expansionist ambitions. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, leading to the Winter War. The Finnish forces, though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, mounted a tenacious defense against the Soviet invaders. Utilizing their knowledge of the harsh winter terrain, the Finns employed guerrilla tactics and achieved notable successes, including the destruction of Soviet tanks and the infliction of heavy casualties. Despite these victories, the overwhelming numerical and material superiority of the Soviet Union eventually prevailed. The Winter War ended in March 1940 with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland was forced to cede significant territories, including the Karelian Isthmus, but retained its independence. The resilience and bravery of the Finnish forces during the Winter War garnered international admiration and highlighted the limitations of Soviet military power. The shift towards active conflict. As the winter of 1939 to 1940 came to an end, the stage was set for a broader and more intense phase of the war. The period of relative calm on the Western Front was about to be shattered. Germany's military leadership, under Hitler's direction, was finalizing plans for a major offensive in Western Europe, aiming to achieve a swift and decisive victory. The invasions of Denmark and Norway in April 1940 marked the beginning of this new phase. Germany sought to secure its northern flank and ensure access to vital resources, particularly Swedish iron ore. The swift and effective invasions demonstrated the continued effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics and set the stage for the major campaigns that would follow in Western Europe. The strategic landscape of Europe was rapidly changing, and the initial successes of the Axis powers highlighted the weaknesses and unpreparedness of the Allied forces. The fall of Poland and the subsequent period of the Phony War provided a stark reminder of the brutal nature of the conflict and the challenges that lay ahead. Conclusion: preparing for the onslaught. As the spring of 1940 approached, the world stood on the brink of a more extensive and destructive phase of the war. The invasion of Poland had demonstrated the devastating power of blitzkrieg, and the phony war had provided a brief respite but also a period of intense preparation and anticipation. The events of late 1939 and early 1940 set the stage for the dramatic and far-reaching campaigns that would soon engulf Europe. The fall of France, the Battle of Britain, and the expansion of the conflict into the Mediterranean and North Africa were just on the horizon. The world was about to witness a conflict of unprecedented scale and ferocity, reshaping the political and social landscape for generations to come. 1940, the year of rapid conquests and dramatic shifts. The invasion of Denmark and Norway. In the early months of 1940, the phony war came to an abrupt end as Germany launched operations in Scandinavia. On April 9, 1940, German forces initiated Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway. The strategic objective was to secure the iron ore shipments from Sweden that were vital to the German war machine and to establish bases for naval and air operations against Britain. Denmark, a swift conquest. Denmark, lacking significant natural defenses and overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the German attack, was unable to mount effective resistance. Within hours, Danish forces were overwhelmed and the government quickly capitulated. The occupation of Denmark was achieved with minimal bloodshed, and German forces turned their attention to Norway. Norway, a protracted struggle. The invasion of Norway was more complex and met with stiffer resistance. German paratroopers and naval forces targeted key cities and ports, including Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. The initial German landings caught the Norwegian defenses off guard, and despite their brave resistance, the Norwegian forces were ill-prepared to repel the invasion. The Allies, recognizing the strategic importance of Norway, launched a counteroffensive to support the Norwegian resistance. British and French troops landed at Narvik and other key points, engaging in fierce battles with German forces. However, the rapid German advance, combined with effective use of air power, forced the Allies to withdraw by early June 1940. Norway fell completely under German control, and King Haakon VII and the Norwegian government fled to Britain, continuing the fight from exile. The fall of France. The most significant event of 1940 was undoubtedly the rapid and dramatic fall of France. Germany's offensive in the West, codenamed Fall-Gelb, Case Yellow, commenced on May 10, 1940. The German strategy, devised by General Erich von Manstein, involved a bold and unconventional thrust through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line. The Blitzkrieg in the West. German panzer divisions, led by generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, spearheaded the attack, moving with lightning speed and overwhelming the French and British forces. The rapid advance caught the Allies by surprise and led to the encirclement of large numbers of Allied troops in Belgium and northern France. The key cities of Brussels and Antwerp fell quickly, and the German forces raced towards the English Channel. The miracle of Dunkirk. One of the most remarkable episodes during this campaign was the evacuation of Dunkirk. By late May, a significant portion of the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and French troops were trapped in a shrinking pocket around Dunkirk. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation effort, was launched on May 26, 1940. Despite heavy bombardment and attacks from German forces, a flotilla of naval vessels, merchant ships, and civilian boats managed to rescue over 330,000 Allied soldiers by June 4th. This miracle provided a significant boost to British morale and ensured that these troops could continue the fight. The collapse of French resistance. Following the evacuation at Dunkirk, the German forces continued their relentless advance into France. Paris fell to the Germans on June 14, 1940, and the French government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, sought an armistice. On June 22, 1940, France officially surrendered, and an armistice was signed at Compiègne. The terms of the armistice divided France into an occupied zone in the north and west, and a nominally independent Vichy regime in the south, which collaborated with the German occupiers. The Battle of Britain. With France defeated, Hitler turned his attention to Britain. The German plan, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, envisioned an amphibious invasion of the British Isles. However, for the invasion to succeed, the Luftwaffe needed to achieve air superiority over the Royal Air Force, RAF. The aerial assault begins. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940, with the Luftwaffe launching sustained bombing raids against British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The aim was to cripple the RAF and pave the way for the invasion. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, deployed a large force of fighters and bombers, believing that they could achieve victory within a few weeks. The RAF fights back. The RAF, however, mounted a determined and resilient defense. Utilizing advanced radar technology, the RAF could effectively coordinate their fighter responses to incoming raids. British pilots, flying iconic aircraft such as the Spitfire and Hurricane, engaged the Luftwaffe in intense dogfights over southern England. The leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and the strategic use of limited resources played a crucial role in the defense. The Blitz. As the battle progressed, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus from military targets to bombing British cities, a campaign known as the Blitz. Starting in September 1940, London and other major cities faced nightly bombing raids intended to break the morale of the British people. Despite the devastation and loss of life, the British public remained defiant, and the government, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, vowed to continue the fight. Conclusion of 1940, a year of high stakes and shifting fortunes. By the end of 1940, the strategic landscape of World War II had shifted dramatically. Germany had achieved stunning victories in Poland, Denmark, Norway, and France, establishing dominance over much of Western Europe. However, the failure to achieve air superiority over Britain and the resilience of the British people marked a significant setback for Hitler's ambitions. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that the Nazi war machine was not invincible and that the Allies, despite suffering severe losses, were capable of mounting effective resistance. The year 1940 set the stage for a prolonged and grueling conflict that would involve nations from every corner of the globe and reshape the world order. The Battle of Britain, continued struggles and shifting strategies. Sustained bombing campaigns. As the summer of 1940 progressed into autumn, the Luftwaffe intensified its bombing campaigns against Britain. The initial focus remained on crippling the RAF and its supporting infrastructure. However, the shift to targeting cities and civilian areas, particularly London, marked a significant change in strategy. This phase, known as the Blitz, began in earnest on September 7, 1940, with a massive bombing raid on London's East End. For 57 consecutive nights, London was bombed, leading to widespread destruction and civilian casualties. The intent behind the Blitz was twofold: to destroy key industrial and logistical targets and to break the morale of the British population. Cities such as Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, and Glasgow also faced heavy bombardments. Despite the severe damage and loss of life, British morale remained remarkably resilient. The government, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, continued to inspire defiance and determination among the populace. Churchill's speeches, broadcast over the radio, became a symbol of British resolve. Technological and tactical innovations. One of the critical factors in the British defense was the effective use of radar technology. The chain-home radar network provided early warning of incoming German raids, allowing the RAF to efficiently deploy fighters to intercept them. This technological edge, combined with the strategic leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who headed RAF Fighter Command, played a crucial role in the defense. The RAF's fighter pilots, often referred to as the Few, showed remarkable bravery and skill in their engagements with the Luftwaffe. Despite being outnumbered, the pilots of the Spitfires and Hurricanes managed to inflict significant losses on the German bombers and their fighter escorts. The use of tightly coordinated tactics, such as the big wing formations advocated by Group Captain Douglas Bader, helped to maximize the effectiveness of the British defenses. The turning point. By late October 1940, it became clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve its primary objectives. The RAF remained intact, and British industrial production continued despite the bombing. The Luftwaffe's losses in aircraft and experienced aircrews were mounting, and the initial hopes for a quick and decisive victory over Britain faded. The failure of the Luftwaffe to secure air superiority forced Hitler to indefinitely postpone Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The Battle of Britain ended as the first major defeat for Nazi Germany and marked a turning point in the war. It demonstrated that Hitler's forces were not invincible and provided a significant boost to Allied morale. The Mediterranean and North Africa, a new theater of war. As the Battle of Britain raged, the conflict expanded into new theaters. The Mediterranean and North African campaigns became increasingly significant as both the Axis and Allied powers sought to control strategic territories and resources. Italian ambitions and early setbacks. In North Africa, Italy, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, sought to expand its empire. Mussolini aimed to create a new Roman Empire, and North Africa was a critical component of this vision. In September 1940, Italian forces launched an invasion of British-controlled Egypt from their bases in Libya. The initial Italian advance made some progress, but logistical challenges and strong British resistance soon halted it. In response, the British launched a counteroffensive, codenamed Operation Compass, in December 1940. The operation was initially intended as a limited raid but quickly turned into a major offensive due to its unexpected success. British and Commonwealth forces, under the command of General Richard O'Connor, achieved a series of stunning victories against the Italians. By February 1941, the British had captured the key port of Tobruk and taken tens of thousands of Italian prisoners. The Italian 10th Army was effectively destroyed, and the British secured a substantial portion of Libya, Greece, and the Balkans. In addition to North Africa, Mussolini also sought to expand Italian influence in the Balkans. In October 1940, Italy invaded Greece, expecting a quick victory. However, the Greek forces, under the leadership of General Alexander Papagos, mounted a determined defense and counterattacked, pushing the Italians back into Albania. The Greek successes against Italy disrupted Axis plans and forced Germany to intervene to stabilize the situation. Hitler ordered preparations for an invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia, leading to further expansion of the conflict in the Balkans. The Atlantic and naval warfare. The war at sea also intensified in 1940. The Battle of the Atlantic became a crucial struggle as Germany sought to cut off Britain's supply lines. German U-boats, submarines, targeted Allied shipping, aiming to sink as many merchant vessels as possible to starve Britain of vital resources. The U-boat threat. The early months of the Battle of the Atlantic saw significant successes for the German U-boats. Operating in wolf packs, groups of U-boats coordinated their attacks on convoys, overwhelming their defenses. The British Royal Navy and Merchant Marine faced severe losses, and the situation became increasingly dire. Technological responses. In response to the U-boat threat, the Allies implemented several technological and tactical innovations. The development of sonar, known as ASTIC in Britain, allowed Allied ships to detect submerged submarines. The introduction of long-range aircraft, such as the consolidated B-24 Liberator, provided aerial support for convoys, extending the range of protection against U-boat attacks. The use of convoy systems, where merchant ships traveled in groups escorted by naval vessels, helped to mitigate the losses. The establishment of air and sea bases in Iceland and Newfoundland also improved the coverage and protection of transatlantic convoys. Conclusion of 1940, setting the stage for a global conflict. By the end of 1940, the scope and scale of World War II had expanded dramatically. Germany's conquests in Europe and the Mediterranean, the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic, and the resilient British defense against the Luftwaffe highlighted the global nature of the conflict. The Axis powers had achieved significant successes, but the Allies, particularly Britain, remained defiant and continued to resist. The events of 1940 set the stage for an even broader and more intense conflict in the years to come. With new theaters of war emerging in the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Atlantic, and with the involvement of more nations, World War II was becoming a truly global struggle. The Mediterranean and North Africa, the Italian struggles and German intervention. The Italian invasion of Greece and German response. As 1940 progressed, Italy's ambitions in the Balkans faced significant challenges. The Italian invasion of Greece in October 1940, intended to be a swift campaign, quickly bogged down. Greek forces not only repelled the initial Italian advances but also launched counterattacks, pushing the Italians back into Albania. This unexpected Greek resistance disrupted Axis plans and threatened to destabilize the region. Hitler, concerned about the potential for a British foothold in the Balkans, decided to intervene. Plans were made for a German invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia, which would take place in early 1941. This decision further expanded the scope of the conflict and demonstrated the interlinked nature of Axis operations across different theaters. The expanding war in North Africa. In North Africa, the British counteroffensive Operation Compass continued to achieve remarkable success. By early 1941, British forces had captured significant Italian-held territory, including the strategically important port of Tobruk. The Italian 10th Army was in disarray, and the Axis position in North Africa was precarious. To address the deteriorating situation, Hitler dispatched General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to North Africa in February 1941. Rommel's arrival marked a turning point in the North African campaign. Known as the Desert Fox for his tactical brilliance, Rommel quickly stabilized the Axis position and launched his own counteroffensive, pushing British forces back and laying the groundwork for future battles in the desert. The naval war, the Battle of the Atlantic, intensifies. The Battle of the Atlantic remained a critical front in 1940. The German U-boat campaign aimed to cut off Britain's supply lines, threatening to starve the island nation of essential resources. The early months of the campaign saw significant successes for the German submarines, with Allied shipping suffering heavy losses. U-boat wolf packs and Allied countermeasures. The use of wolf pack tactics, where groups of U-boats coordinated their attacks on convoys, proved highly effective. These tactics overwhelmed the escorts and inflicted substantial damage on Allied shipping. The situation was dire, and the Allies needed to find effective countermeasures to turn the tide. In response, the Allies implemented several innovations and strategies. The convoy system, where merchant ships traveled in groups protected by naval escorts, became more widespread and better organized. Advances in sonar technology, ASTIC, allowed Allied ships to detect submerged U-boats, improving their ability to defend against attacks. Long-range patrol aircraft, such as the consolidated B-24 Liberator, extended the reach of Allied anti-submarine efforts. These aircraft could provide air cover for convoys across the Atlantic, reducing the areas where U-boats could operate with impunity. The development of radar technology further enhanced the effectiveness of these patrols. The impact of code breaking. Another critical factor in the Battle of the Atlantic was the breaking of German naval codes. The British code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park, led by figures such as Alan Turing, succeeded in decrypting the encrypted communications used by the German Navy. This intelligence, known as Ultra, provided the Allies with valuable information about U-boat movements and intentions, allowing them to better protect their convoys and target U-boat operations. The political landscape, shifts and alliances. As 1940 drew to a close, the political landscape of the war continued to evolve. The Axis powers solidified their alliances, while the Allies sought to build a coalition to resist Axis aggression. The Tripartite Pact. On September 27, 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, formally establishing the Axis powers. The pact aimed to deter the United States from entering the war and to solidify the military and political cooperation between the three nations. The Tripartite Pact stipulated that if any of the signatories were attacked by a country not already involved in the war, the others would come to its aid. The United States and Lend-Lease. While the United States remained officially neutral, its support for the Allied cause grew throughout 1940. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized the threat posed by the Axis powers and sought ways to aid Britain without directly entering the war. In December 1940, Roosevelt introduced the concept of Lend-Lease, which would allow the U.S. to supply military equipment and supplies to Allied nations on a lend or lease basis. Lend-Lease marked a significant shift in American policy and demonstrated the increasing involvement of the United States in the global conflict. The program provided critical support to Britain and, later, to other Allied nations, bolstering their ability to resist Axis aggression. The year 1940 was a year of rapid conquests, dramatic shifts, and intense preparation for the prolonged conflict that lay ahead. Germany's stunning victories in Western Europe, the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic, and the expansion of the war into the Mediterranean and North Africa highlighted the global nature of the conflict. The resilience of Britain during the Battle of Britain, the initial successes of the British in North Africa, and the evolving political alliances set the stage for the next phases of the war. As 1940 came to an end, the world stood on the brink of even greater and more widespread conflict, with the Axis powers seeking further expansion and the Allies preparing to intensify their resistance. The events of 1940 demonstrated the complexity and interconnectedness of the war, with battles and campaigns in one theater influencing strategies and outcomes in others. The global struggle that characterized World War II was now fully underway, reshaping the political and social landscape for years to come. 1941, the war expands and intensifies. Let's dive into 1941, a year marked by significant escalations and pivotal moments in World War II. This year saw the war truly becoming a global conflict with major developments on multiple fronts. The North African Campaign. At the start of 1941, the North African theater of war was heating up. The British had inflicted severe defeats on the Italian forces, pushing them back and capturing key locations like Tobruk. However, the arrival of General Owen Rommel and the Afrika Korps in February 1941 changed everything. Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, was a master of mobile warfare. His tactics were bold and innovative, often catching the British off guard. Despite facing logistical challenges and being outnumbered, Rommel managed to launch a successful counteroffensive. By April, he had recaptured much of the territory the Italians had lost, including laying siege to Tobruk, a critical port held by the British. The siege of Tobruk became a prolonged and grueling battle, with the defenders enduring constant assaults and bombardments. Rommel's success in North Africa demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, coordinated use of tanks, infantry, and air support. His ability to exploit the terrain and surprise his opponents earned him a formidable reputation. The Balkans Campaign. While Rommel was making strides in North Africa, the situation in the Balkans was also deteriorating for the Allies. Italy's invasion of Greece in October 1940 had been a disaster. Greek forces not only repelled the Italians but pushed them back into Albania. This failure prompted Hitler to intervene to support his ally and secure his southern flank for the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. In April 1941, Germany launched simultaneous invasions of Yugoslavia and Greece. The Yugoslav government had initially resisted joining the Axis, leading to a coup that brought a pro-Allied regime to power. In response, Hitler ordered the invasion of Yugoslavia. German forces, using blitzkrieg tactics, quickly overwhelmed Yugoslav defenses. Within weeks, Yugoslavia was defeated and partitioned between Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The invasion of Greece followed a similar pattern. German forces, advancing from Bulgaria, swiftly overran Greek defenses and occupied Athens by the end of April. British and Commonwealth forces sent to aid Greece were forced to retreat to Crete, where they continued to resist until the island fell in May. The fall of Greece and Yugoslavia secured Germany's southern flank and safeguarded the vital Romanian oil fields. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The most significant and ambitious operation of 1941 was undoubtedly Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Launched on June 22, 1941, Barbarossa was the largest military operation in history, involving millions of troops along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Hitler's strategic goal was to quickly conquer the Soviet Union, secure its vast resources, and eliminate what he saw as the Bolshevik threat. The invasion began with a massive and coordinated assault, with German forces advancing rapidly into Soviet territory. The initial successes were staggering. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, and key cities like Minsk and Smolensk fell within weeks. The German advance was relentless. The Wehrmacht used blitzkrieg tactics to devastating effect, combining fast-moving tank divisions, mechanized infantry, and close air support to break through Soviet lines and encircle large formations. The Red Army, taken by surprise and still reeling from Stalin's purges of its officer corps, struggled to mount an effective defense. Despite these challenges, Soviet resistance began to stiffen as the Germans approached key cities. As the summer turned to autumn, the Germans pushed deeper into Soviet territory, reaching the outskirts of Leningrad in the north and making significant inroads towards Moscow in the center and the oil-rich Caucasus in the south. The vast distances, difficult terrain, and harsh weather conditions strained German logistics and supply lines. The Soviet Union, despite its initial losses, began to regroup and launch counteroffensives. The Battle of Moscow, which began in October, marked a significant turning point. The Soviets, under the command of General Zhukov, organized a determined defense of the capital. Stalin called on all available resources and manpower to defend Moscow, even deploying troops from Siberia, previously stationed there as a precaution against a Japanese invasion. The harsh winter weather played a critical role as temperatures plummeted and the German advance ground to a halt. In December, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back from the city's outskirts and demonstrating that the Soviet Union was far from defeated. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States enters the war. While Europe and North Africa were engulfed in conflict, tensions in the Pacific were reaching a boiling point. Japan, having already occupied Manchuria and large parts of China, continued its aggressive expansion in Asia. The occupation of French Indochina in 1940 led to increasing friction with the United States, which responded with economic sanctions, including an oil embargo that threatened Japan's industrial and military capabilities. Faced with the prospect of economic strangulation and unwilling to abandon its imperial ambitions, Japan decided to strike preemptively. The Japanese leadership, under Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, planned a surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The goal was to cripple the U.S. Navy, giving Japan free rein to seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In a meticulously planned and executed assault, Japanese aircraft targeted battleships, aircraft carriers, and other military installations. The attack was devastating, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and destroying nearly 200 aircraft. Over 2,400 Americans were killed in the attack. The attack on Pearl Harbor had a profound impact. The following day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress swiftly declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States shortly thereafter, bringing the U.S. fully into the global conflict. The entry of the United States into the war marked a turning point, as its vast industrial and military capabilities would significantly bolster the Allied effort. The expansion of the Pacific War. The attack on Pearl Harbor was just the beginning of Japan's offensive. Simultaneously, Japanese forces launched coordinated attacks across the Pacific. They struck at American bases in the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, as well as British holdings in Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore. The speed and ferocity of the Japanese advance stunned the Allies. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, were quickly overwhelmed. By January 1942, Japanese forces had landed on the main islands, and by March, MacArthur was ordered to evacuate to Australia, famously vowing, "I shall return." The remaining Allied forces in the Philippines continued to resist until they were forced to surrender in April 1942, leading to the infamous Bataan Death March. In Southeast Asia, the British suffered severe setbacks. The Japanese invasion of Malaya and the capture of Singapore in February 1942 were major blows. Singapore, considered an impregnable fortress, fell after a brief and intense campaign with over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops taken prisoner. This loss marked the largest surrender of British-led forces in history and demonstrated Japan's dominance in the region. The Eastern Front, the struggle for survival. Back in Europe, the Eastern Front continued to be a focal point of the conflict. After the initial shock of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet Union was gradually regaining its footing. The harsh winter of 1941 to 1942 played a significant role in halting the German advance. The German troops, unprepared for the extreme cold, faced severe hardships as temperatures dropped and supply lines stretched thin. The Soviet counteroffensive, launched in December 1941, marked the first major setback for the Germans. Under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army launched a series of coordinated attacks along the front, pushing the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow. This counteroffensive not only relieved the immediate threat to the Soviet capital, but also demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Soviet forces. Throughout 1941, the Eastern Front witnessed some of the most brutal and intense fighting of the war. Cities like Leningrad faced prolonged sieges, with civilians and soldiers enduring unimaginable hardships. The Siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941 and would last for over 2 years, became a symbol of Soviet endurance and defiance. Despite the dire conditions, the city's defenders and inhabitants resisted fiercely, refusing to surrender. The Atlantic and naval warfare. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Atlantic continued to rage as German U-boats targeted Allied shipping. The goal was to cut off Britain's supply lines and starve the island nation into submission. Early in 1941, German U-boats, operating in wolf packs, achieved significant successes, sinking large numbers of merchant ships and causing severe disruptions. The Allies, recognizing the critical importance of maintaining their supply lines, implemented several strategies to counter the U-boat threat. Convoy systems, where merchant ships traveled in groups escorted by naval vessels, became more organized and effective. Advances in sonar technology, ASTIC, and the introduction of long-range patrol aircraft, such as the consolidated B-24 Liberator, extended the reach of Allied anti-submarine efforts. One of the key factors in turning the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was the breaking of the German Enigma codes. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, led by figures like Alan Turing, succeeded in decrypting the Enigma encrypted communications used by the German Navy. This intelligence, known as Ultra, provided the Allies with valuable information about U-boat movements and intentions, allowing them to better protect their convoys and target U-boat operations. The home front and Allied cooperation. 1941 also saw significant developments on the home fronts of the warring nations. In the United States, the mobilization for war began in earnest following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Factories were retooled to produce war materials, and millions of Americans joined the armed forces. The Lend-Lease program, which had been providing aid to Britain, was expanded to include the Soviet Union and other Allied nations, further strengthening the cooperative efforts against the Axis powers. In Britain, the war effort continued to mobilize the entire population. Rationing, air raid precautions, and the evacuation of children from cities were part of everyday life. The Blitz, although less intense than in 1940, continued to be a threat. British cities, including London, faced periodic bombing raids, but the resilience and determination of the British people remained unbroken. The Soviet Union, after the initial shock of the German invasion, mobilized its vast resources for a prolonged struggle. The entire Soviet society was geared towards the war effort, with industries relocated to the east, away from the front lines, and millions of men and women conscripted into the Red Army and labor forces. The determination to defend the motherland and repel the invaders became a unifying force for the Soviet people. The Eastern Front, the battle for survival, continues. As 1941 progressed, the Eastern Front remained the most brutal and extensive theater of the war. The Soviet Union, having survived the initial onslaught of Operation Barbarossa, was now in a desperate struggle to push back the German invaders. The winter of 1941 to 1942 brought some respite to the Soviets, as the harsh conditions severely hampered German operations. The Soviet counteroffensive, which began in December 1941, was a pivotal moment. The Red Army launched a series of attacks around Moscow, driving the Germans back and inflicting heavy casualties. The success of this counteroffensive boosted Soviet morale and demonstrated that the German army was not invincible. It also marked the first major strategic setback for the Wehrmacht, which had previously seemed unstoppable. Despite the setbacks, the Germans regrouped and prepared for renewed offensives in the spring of 1942. The battles on the Eastern Front continued to be characterized by their sheer scale and intensity, with massive losses on both sides. The struggle for control of key cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad would come to define the brutal nature of the Eastern Front. The Pacific Theater, Japanese expansion and Allied response. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was a turning point that brought the United States fully into World War II. Following the attack, Japan launched a series of coordinated offensives across the Pacific, targeting American, British, Dutch, and Australian territories. The Philippines. In the Philippines, Japanese forces quickly overwhelmed the American and Filipino defenders. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Allied forces, was forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. The defenders held out for several months under desperate conditions, but by April 1942, they were forced to surrender. The subsequent Bataan Death March, in which thousands of American and Filipino prisoners of war were subjected to brutal treatment, became a symbol of Japanese cruelty and galvanized American resolve. Southeast Asia. Japanese forces also struck at British and Dutch territories in Southeast Asia. The invasion of Malaya and the capture of Singapore in February 1942 were major blows to the British Empire. Singapore, considered an impregnable fortress, fell after a brief but intense campaign, resulting in the capture of over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops. The loss of Singapore marked a significant defeat and exposed the vulnerabilities of British colonial defenses. In the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, Japanese forces quickly overran the Dutch defenses. The capture of the oil-rich islands was a strategic victory for Japan, providing crucial resources to fuel its war machine. The rapid Japanese advances demonstrated the effectiveness of their military strategy and the unpreparedness of the Allies in the region. The Atlantic and naval warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic continued to be a critical front in 1941. German U-boats aimed to disrupt Allied shipping and cut off Britain's vital supply lines. The early months of the campaign saw significant successes for the U-boats, which operated in coordinated wolf packs to attack convoys. Allied countermeasures. To counter the U-boat threat, the Allies implemented several strategies. The convoy system, where merchant ships traveled in groups protected by naval escorts, became more organized and effective. Advances in sonar technology, ASTIC, allowed Allied ships to detect and track U-boats underwater, improving their ability to defend against attacks. The introduction of long-range patrol aircraft, such as the consolidated B-24 Liberator, provided air cover for convoys across the Atlantic, reducing the areas where U-boats could operate with impunity. These aircraft played a crucial role in spotting and attacking U-boats on the surface. Code breaking and intelligence. One of the key factors in turning the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was the breaking of the German Enigma codes. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, led by figures like Alan Turing, succeeded in decrypting the Enigma encrypted communications used by the German Navy. This intelligence, known as Ultra, provided the Allies with valuable information about U-boat movements and intentions, allowing them to better protect their convoys and target U-boat operations. The home fronts, mobilization and production. As the war intensified, the home fronts of the warring nations became increasingly important. The industrial and economic mobilization of the Allied powers played a crucial role in sustaining the war effort. The United States. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States rapidly mobilized for war. Factories were retooled to produce war materials, and millions of Americans joined the armed forces. The Lend-Lease program, which had been providing aid to Britain, was expanded to include the Soviet Union and other allied nations. This program supplied critical resources and equipment, bolstering the Allies' ability to resist Axis aggression. American society underwent significant changes as the nation geared up for war. Women entered the workforce in large numbers, taking on roles traditionally held by men. The iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of female contribution to the war effort. The U.S. economy, driven by wartime production, emerged from the Great Depression and entered a period of rapid growth. In Britain, the war effort continued to mobilize the entire population. Rationing, air raid precautions, and the evacuation of children from cities were part of everyday life. The Blitz, although less intense than in 1940, continued to be a threat. British cities, including London, faced periodic bombing raids, but the resilience and determination of the British people remained unbroken. The Soviet Union, after the initial shock of the German invasion, mobilized its vast resources for a prolonged struggle. Entire industries were relocated to the east, away from the front lines, and millions of men and women were conscripted into the Red Army and labor forces. The determination to defend the motherland and repel the invaders became a unifying force for the Soviet people. The efforts on the home fronts were crucial in sustaining the military operations on the front lines. The ability to produce and supply weapons, ammunition, and other essential materials gave the Allies a significant advantage as the war continued to escalate. 1941 was a year of dramatic changes and significant developments in World War II. The entry of the United States into the conflict following the attack on Pearl Harbor marked a turning point, bringing a major industrial power into the war against the Axis. The relentless fighting on the Eastern Front, the expanding battles in the Pacific, and the ongoing struggle in the Atlantic all demonstrated the global scale of the conflict. The resilience of the Soviet Union in the face of the German onslaught, the strategic shifts in the Mediterranean and North Africa, and the determined Allied efforts to protect vital supply lines set the stage for the future course of the war. The events of 1941 laid the groundwork for the eventual turning of the tide in favor of the Allies, leading to the ultimate defeat of the Axis powers. 1942, the tide begins to turn. 1942 was a critical year in World War II, marking several pivotal moments that began to shift the momentum in favor of the Allies. This year saw intense and decisive battles on multiple fronts, with significant developments in Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa. The Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad begins. The Eastern Front continued to be the most brutal and significant theater of the war. After the failure of Operation Barbarossa and the winter counteroffensive by the Soviets, Hitler launched a renewed summer offensive in 1942, codenamed Operation Blue. The objective was to capture the oil-rich regions of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The offensive began in June, with the German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, advancing towards Stalingrad. Stalingrad was not only a major industrial center but also held symbolic importance, being named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The city's capture was intended to secure the Volga River and cut off Soviet access to vital resources. The Battle of Stalingrad, which started in August 1942, quickly turned into one of the most ferocious and devastating battles in history. The fighting was characterized by intense urban warfare, with both sides engaging in brutal house-to-house combat. The Germans initially made significant progress, capturing large parts of the city. However, the Soviet 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chukov, mounted a tenacious defense, turning the city's ruins into a fortress. As the battle dragged on, the Soviets planned a massive counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, launched in November 1942. The operation aimed to encircle and trap the German Sixth Army within Stalingrad. The Soviets successfully executed a double envelopment, cutting off and encircling over 250,000 Axis troops. The trapped German forces faced starvation, harsh winter conditions, and relentless Soviet attacks. Despite Hitler's orders to hold their ground, the situation for the Germans became increasingly desperate. The Pacific Theater, the Battle of Midway. In the Pacific, 1942 was marked by crucial naval battles that shifted the balance of power. Following their early successes, Japanese forces aimed to further expand their dominance and eliminate the U.S. Pacific Fleet as a strategic threat. The Japanese planned a major offensive to capture Midway Atoll, a strategic point that would allow them to extend their defensive perimeter and potentially threaten Hawaii and the west coast of the United States. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th to 7th, 1942, was a turning point in the Pacific War. Thanks to intelligence efforts, including breaking Japanese naval codes, the United States was aware of Japan's plans and prepared an ambush. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding the U.S. Pacific Fleet, positioned his forces to surprise the Japanese. The battle began with Japanese carrier aircraft attacking Midway Island. However, American carrier aircraft, launched from the USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, managed to locate and strike the Japanese carriers. In a series of devastating attacks, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, turning the tide of the battle. The loss of these carriers, along with experienced pilots and crew, dealt a severe blow to the Japanese Navy from which it never fully recovered. North Africa, the turning point at El Alamein. In North Africa, the year 1942 saw significant developments as well. After initial successes, German and Italian forces under General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, were pushing deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and British supply lines. The British Eighth Army, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, prepared to halt Rommel's advance. The First Battle of El Alamein, fought in July 1942, stalled Rommel's offensive, preventing him from capturing Alexandria and the Suez Canal. Both sides dug in, and a period of stalemate ensued. Montgomery spent the next few months building up his forces and preparing for a decisive counteroffensive. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which began on October 23, 1942, marked a turning point in the North African campaign. Montgomery's meticulously planned attack involved extensive use of artillery and coordinated infantry and armored assaults. Over several weeks, the British forces gradually wore down Rommel's defenses, forcing the Axis to retreat. By November, Rommel's forces were in full retreat, and the Allies had gained the upper hand in North Africa. The home fronts, mobilization and production. 1942 was also a year of significant effort and sacrifice on the home fronts. In the United States, the war effort was in full swing. Factories were retooled to produce war materials, and millions of Americans joined the armed forces. The Lend-Lease program continued to provide critical support to Britain and the Soviet Union, ensuring they had the resources needed to continue the fight. American society underwent dramatic changes as women entered the workforce in large numbers, filling roles traditionally held by men. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter symbolized the crucial contributions of women to the war effort. Rationing, war bonds, and civilian defense initiatives became part of everyday life as the entire nation mobilized for war. In Britain, the resilience of the civilian population remained a key factor. Despite ongoing air raids and the hardships of wartime, the British people continued to support the war effort with determination. The Blitz spirit, characterized by resilience and defiance, remained strong. The British economy was geared towards war production, and every effort was made to support the front lines. In the Soviet Union, the war effort was a matter of survival. The entire nation was mobilized to resist the German invasion. Factories were relocated east of the Ural Mountains to protect them from German advances, and the Soviet people endured immense hardships to keep the war machine running. The sense of patriotism and determination to defend the motherland unified the Soviet populace, shifting the momentum. By the end of 1942, the tide of the war was beginning to turn. The Allies had achieved significant victories in the Pacific, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. The Battle of Midway crippled the Japanese Navy. The successes in North Africa paved the way for the eventual Allied invasion of Italy, and the Battle of Stalingrad set the stage for a major Soviet offensive. The year 1942 marked the beginning of a shift in momentum. The Axis powers were still formidable, but the Allies were gaining strength and coordination. The cooperation between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union began to bear fruit, setting the stage for the eventual defeat of the Axis powers. The Eastern Front, the Siege of Leningrad, and the continuation of the Battle of Stalingrad. The Eastern Front continued to be a scene of immense suffering and epic battles in 1942. Alongside the Battle of Stalingrad, the Siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, was another crucial and grueling campaign. The Siege of Leningrad. The Siege of Leningrad had begun in September 1941, and by 1942, it had turned into one of the longest and most devastating sieges in history. German and Finnish forces surrounded the city, cutting off all supply routes and subjecting its inhabitants to relentless bombardment and starvation. The city's defenders and its civilian population faced extreme hardships, with food shortages leading to severe malnutrition and starvation. Despite the dire conditions, the Soviet Union managed to establish a lifeline via the Road of Life, a supply route across the frozen Lake Ladoga during the winter. This precarious route allowed limited food and supplies to reach the besieged city. The determination and resilience of Leningrad's residents became legendary as they continued to work in munitions factories, support the war effort, and resist the invaders. The continuation of the Battle of Stalingrad. Back in Stalingrad, the encircled German Sixth Army faced a dire situation. The Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, had successfully trapped the German forces within the city. As winter set in, the conditions worsened for the German troops, who were poorly equipped for the harsh weather. Supplies ran dangerously low, and the soldiers suffered from frostbite, starvation, and constant Soviet attacks. Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold their positions and forbade any attempts to break out or surrender. This decision condemned the German troops to a slow and agonizing defeat. The Soviets, on the other hand, were determined to eliminate the encircled forces. General Zhukov and his commanders planned a series of offensives to tighten the noose around Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet determination and resilience. It was a brutal, grinding conflict that saw massive casualties on both sides. By the end of 1942, the fate of the German Sixth Army was sealed, setting the stage for their eventual surrender in early 1943. This victory marked a significant turning point on the Eastern Front as the Red Army began to gain the upper hand. The Pacific Theater, the Solomon Islands, and the Guadalcanal Campaign. In the Pacific, 1942 saw the continuation of the struggle between Japanese and Allied forces, with the Solomon Islands becoming a major battleground. The Guadalcanal Campaign. The Guadalcanal Campaign was a critical series of battles in the Pacific Theater. It began in August 1942 when Allied forces, primarily U.S. Marines, landed on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The objective was to deny the Japanese the use of the island's airfield, which they were constructing to threaten Allied supply routes to Australia and New Zealand. The initial landings caught the Japanese by surprise, and the Allies quickly secured the airfield, which they named Henderson Field. However, the battle for Guadalcanal was far from over. The Japanese launched numerous counterattacks, both by land and sea, to retake the island. The fighting on Guadalcanal was intense and brutal. The dense jungle terrain, tropical diseases, and fierce combat made it a grueling campaign for both sides. Naval battles, such as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, were fought to control the waters around Guadalcanal and ensure supply lines. The turning point came in November 1942 during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. This series of engagements saw significant losses on both sides, but the Allies managed to retain control of Henderson Field. By the end of the year, Japanese attempts to retake the island had been repelled, and the momentum began to shift in favor of the Allies in the Pacific. North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein and Operation Torch. In North Africa, the year 1942 saw significant developments that would lead to the eventual defeat of Axis forces in the region. The Second Battle of El Alamein. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which began on October 23, 1942, was a turning point in the North African campaign. General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army launched a meticulously planned offensive against General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. The battle started with a massive artillery barrage, followed by coordinated infantry and armored assaults. Montgomery's strategy focused on breaking through the heavily fortified German and Italian defenses and then exploiting the breach with armored divisions. Over the course of several weeks, the Allies gradually wore down Rommel's forces, who faced severe shortages of supplies and reinforcements. By early November, the Axis lines had been breached and Rommel ordered a retreat. The victory at El Alamein was a significant morale boost for the Allies and marked the beginning of the end for Axis forces in North Africa. Churchill famously remarked, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Operation Torch. Following the success at El Alamein, the Allies launched Operation Torch, an ambitious plan to invade French North Africa. The operation began on November 8, 1942, with landings in Morocco and Algeria by American and British forces. The objective was to secure the region, expel Axis forces, and open a new front to pressure the Germans and Italians from the west. Operation Torch was the first major combined operation involving American forces in the European theater. It marked the beginning of a close collaboration between American and British military leaders. The landings were successful, and after initial resistance from Vichy French forces, the Allies quickly gained control of the key ports and airfields. The success of Operation Torch put additional pressure on Rommel's retreating forces, forcing them to defend on multiple fronts. It also paved the way for the eventual Allied invasion of Italy and the liberation of Europe. The home fronts, mobilization and effort. 1942 continued to see intense efforts on the home fronts of the warring nations. In the United States, the full mobilization of the economy for war production was underway. Factories produced vast quantities of tanks, planes, ships, and other war materials. Women played a crucial role in the workforce, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, as they took on jobs traditionally held by men. In Britain, the civilian population endured continued rationing and air raids, but morale remained high. The British people were determined to support the war effort, and their resilience was vital to the country's ability to continue fighting. In the Soviet Union, the war effort was all-consuming. Entire industries were relocated eastward to protect them from the German advance, and the Soviet people endured immense hardships to keep the war machine running. The sense of patriotism and the determination to defend the motherland unified the Soviet populace in their fight against the invaders. A year of turning points. By the end of 1942, the tide of World War II was beginning to turn. The Allies had achieved significant victories in the Pacific, North Africa, and on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Midway had crippled the Japanese Navy. The successes in North Africa had paved the way for future Allied advances, and the Battle of Stalingrad was setting the stage for a major Soviet counteroffensive. The momentum was shifting in favor of the Allies, and the cooperation between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union was strengthening. The events of 1942 laid the groundwork for the eventual defeat of the Axis powers, setting the stage for the critical battles and campaigns that would follow in the coming years. The Eastern Front, the struggle at Stalingrad and beyond. As the brutal winter of 1942 set in, the situation for the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad grew increasingly desperate. Encircled by Soviet forces after Operation Uranus, they faced harsh winter conditions, starvation, and relentless Soviet attacks. General Paulus requested permission to break out of the encirclement, but Hitler's orders were clear: the Sixth Army was to hold its ground at all costs. Inside the city, the Soviets intensified their attacks. The harsh urban combat continued, with soldiers fighting block by block and building by building. The Soviet strategy was to tighten the noose around the encircled Germans, cutting off any hope of resupply or escape. The Luftwaffe's attempts to airlift supplies into the pocket were largely ineffective, with many aircraft being shot down and the supplies insufficient to sustain the trapped forces. By December 1942, the Soviet offensives were gaining momentum. Operation Little Saturn, launched on December 16th, aimed to destroy the Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian forces supporting the Germans on the Don River. The success of this operation further weakened the Axis position on the Eastern Front and isolated the German Sixth Army even more. As the year ended, the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. The Soviets were preparing for the final push to eliminate the encircled forces in Stalingrad, and the Germans were running out of time and resources. The Pacific Theater, the battle for Guadalcanal continues. In the Pacific, the Guadalcanal campaign continued to be a focal point of the conflict between Japanese and Allied forces. After securing Anderson Field, the Allies faced continuous Japanese counterattacks both on land and at sea. The dense jungle terrain and tropical diseases added to the difficulties faced by both sides. The naval battles around Guadalcanal were crucial in determining control of the sea lanes and the ability to reinforce and resupply the troops on the island. The Battle of Cape Esperance in October and the naval battle of Guadalcanal in November were significant engagements that saw heavy losses on both sides. However, the Allies managed to retain control of Henderson Field and the surrounding areas. By the end of 1942, the Japanese had exhausted their ability to continue major offensive operations on Guadalcanal. The attrition warfare had taken a heavy toll on their forces, and they began to consider withdrawal from the island. For the Allies, the struggle for Guadalcanal was a hard-fought but critical victory that marked the beginning of their offensive operations in the Pacific. North Africa, Axis retreat and Allied advances. In North Africa, the success of the Second Battle of El Alamein and Operation Torch had turned the tide in favor of the Allies. Following their defeat at El Alamein, Rommel's Afrika Korps was in full retreat across Libya. The British Eighth Army, now bolstered by fresh supplies and reinforcements, pursued the retreating Axis forces relentlessly. Operation Torch had established Allied control over French North Africa, and the newly arrived American forces were eager to engage the enemy. The Allies aimed to trap the retreating Axis forces between the British 8th Army advancing from the east and the American and British forces moving in from the west. As the Allies advanced, they encountered stiff resistance from German and Italian rearguard actions. However, the numerical and logistical superiority of the Allies began to overwhelm the Axis defenses. The port city of Tripoli fell to the British in January 1943, and the Axis forces continued to fall back towards Tunisia. The home front's efforts and sacrifices. On the home fronts, the war effort intensified in 1942. In the United States, the full mobilization for war production was underway. Factories were operating around the clock, producing tanks, planes, ships, and other essential war materials. The American economy, driven by wartime production, was booming, and the workforce saw significant changes as women took on roles traditionally held by men. Rationing, war bonds, and civilian defense initiatives became part of daily life. The public was constantly reminded of the importance of their contributions to the war effort through propaganda campaigns and patriotic appeals. In Britain, the civilian population continued to endure hardships with resilience. Rationing was strict, and air raids were a constant threat, but the spirit of defiance remained strong. The British people were determined to support their military forces and contribute to the eventual victory. In the Soviet Union, the war effort was all-consuming. The Soviet people faced immense hardships as they worked to keep the war machine running. Entire industries had been relocated to the east to protect them from the German advance, and the population was mobilized to support the front lines. The sense of patriotism and the determination to defend the motherland unified the Soviet populace in their fight against the invaders. Scientific and technological advances. 1942 also saw significant scientific and technological advances that would impact the course of the war. In the United States, the Manhattan Project, the secret effort to develop an atomic bomb, was making progress. Scientists, including many who had fled from Nazi-occupied Europe, were working tirelessly to unlock the secrets of nuclear fission. This project would eventually lead to a new and devastating weapon that would change the nature of warfare. In the field of radar technology, both the Allies and the Axis made significant improvements. Radar became a crucial tool for detecting enemy aircraft and ships, providing a strategic advantage in both the Pacific and European theaters. The development of more sophisticated radar systems helped the Allies to better defend against air raids and coordinate their own offensive operations. Summary of key developments in 1942. 1942 was a year of crucial battles and strategic shifts. The Axis powers continued their aggressive campaigns, but the Allies began to mount effective resistance and achieve significant victories. Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad saw the beginning of the end for the German 6th Army, while the Soviet counteroffensives started to push back the Axis forces. Pacific Theater. The Guadalcanal campaign marked a turning point in the war against Japan, with the Allies securing a critical foothold in the Solomon Islands. North Africa. The Allied victories at El Alamein and the success of Operation Torch forced the Axis into retreat, setting the stage for future operations in the Mediterranean. Home fronts. The mobilization and sacrifices on the home fronts provided the necessary support for the military efforts, with significant contributions from civilians and advancements in technology. As 1942 drew to a close, the stage was set for continued Allied offensives and the eventual turning of the tide in favor of the Allies. The determination and resilience of the Allied nations, combined with their growing military and industrial capabilities, began to shift the balance of power in the global conflict. 1943. The turning tide. 1943 was a year of significant turning points in World War II, where the momentum began to decisively shift in favor of the Allies. Key battles and strategic decisions marked this year, leading to crucial changes on multiple fronts. The Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad and the Kursk Offensive. The beginning of 1943 saw the dramatic conclusion of the Battle of Stalingrad. After being encircled by Soviet forces in November 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, was in a dire situation. Despite Hitler's orders to hold their ground, the lack of supplies, severe winter conditions, and relentless Soviet attacks made their position untenable. The surrender at Stalingrad. On February 2, 1943, General Paulus and the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered to the Soviets. This marked one of the most significant defeats for Nazi Germany. The surrender of nearly 91,000 German soldiers, including 22 generals, was a catastrophic blow to German morale and military capability. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience and determination, and it marked the beginning of a major shift on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk. After the defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans sought to regain the initiative with Operation Citadel, aiming to encircle Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. The Battle of Kursk, which took place from July to August 1943, was one of the largest tank battles in history. Both sides amassed huge numbers of tanks and men, preparing for a decisive confrontation. The Soviets, aware of German plans through intelligence and reconnaissance, had fortified their positions extensively. When the German offensive began on July 5, 1943, they faced well-prepared defenses. Despite initial gains, the German advance stalled, and the Soviets launched powerful counteroffensives, including Operation Kutuzov and Operation Polkovodets-Rumiantsev. By August, the German forces were in retreat, and the Soviets had secured a significant victory. The failure of the German offensive at Kursk marked the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From this point on, the Red Army began a series of relentless offensives that would push the Germans back towards Berlin. The Mediterranean theater, the invasion of Sicily and Italy. In the Mediterranean, the Allies continued to build on their successes from 1942. The capture of North Africa allowed the Allies to plan further operations against the Axis powers in Europe. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. On July 9 to 10, 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. This was a massive amphibious and airborne operation involving American, British, and Canadian forces. The objective was to remove the Axis presence from the island, secure the Mediterranean sea lanes, and pave the way for the invasion of Italy. The landings faced resistance, but the Allies, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower and British General Bernard Montgomery, managed to secure a foothold. Over the next few weeks, they pushed inland, overcoming the German and Italian defenders. By August 17, 1943, the island was fully in Allied hands. The success of Operation Husky had significant strategic implications, forcing Italy to reconsider its position in the war. The fall of Mussolini and the invasion of Italy. The invasion of Sicily and the growing threat of an Allied invasion of mainland Italy led to political upheaval in Italy. On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini was arrested after a coup d'état, and King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new prime minister. Badoglio began secret negotiations with the Allies for an armistice. On September 3, 1943, The same day that Allied forces landed on the Italian mainland at Salerno, Operation Avalanche, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. The announcement of the armistice on September 8th led to chaos and confusion. German forces quickly moved to disarm Italian troops and occupy key positions, including Rome. The Allies faced stiff German resistance as they advanced northward. The battles for control of southern Italy were intense, with key engagements at Salerno, Naples, and Monte Cassino. The rugged terrain and well-fortified German positions made the Allied advance slow and costly, but by the end of 1943, the Allies had made significant progress, liberating parts of southern Italy. The Pacific Theater, the Island Hopping Campaign. In the Pacific, the Allies continued their strategy of island hopping, targeting key Japanese-held islands to secure bases for further advances towards Japan. The battles of New Georgia and Bougainville. In the Solomon Islands, following the hard-fought victory at Guadalcanal, the Allies targeted New Georgia and Bougainville. The New Georgia Campaign, which began in June 1943, aimed to capture the island and neutralize the Japanese airfield at Munda. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies secured New Georgia by August. The Bougainville Campaign started in November 1943, with the objective of establishing airfields to support further operations in the Pacific. The landings faced heavy Japanese resistance, but the Allies gradually secured control of key areas. The establishment of airfields on Bougainville allowed the Allies to launch air raids on Japanese positions and support subsequent campaigns. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns. The Allies also focused on the Central Pacific, with significant operations in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. The Battle of Tarawa, part of the Gilbert Islands campaign, took place in November 1943. The heavily fortified Japanese defenses on the small island of Bidio in the Tarawa Atoll led to intense and bloody fighting. Despite high casualties, the Allies captured the island, demonstrating the brutal nature of Pacific warfare. Following Tarawa, the Allies launched the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944, targeting key atolls such as Kwajalein and Eniwetok. These operations aimed to establish bases for further advances towards the Mariana Islands and ultimately Japan. The home fronts sustained efforts and challenges. As the war progressed, the home fronts continued to play a crucial role in supporting the military efforts. In the United States, the war economy was in full swing. Factories operated at maximum capacity, producing vast quantities of war materials. The workforce saw significant contributions from women and minorities who filled roles traditionally held by men. In Britain, the civilian population endured continued hardships but remained resolute. Rationing, air raids, and the pressures of total war tested the resilience of the British people. The government's propaganda efforts emphasized unity and determination, bolstering public morale. In the Soviet Union, the war effort consumed every aspect of life. The relocation of industries to the east, away from the front lines, ensured that the Red Army had the resources needed to continue the fight. The Soviet people faced immense hardships, but their determination to defeat the invaders fueled their relentless resistance. The Eastern Front, Soviet counteroffensives, and the liberation of key territories. As 1943 progressed, the Soviet Union capitalized on the momentum gained from their victory at Stalingrad and the failure of the German offensive at Kursk. The Red Army launched a series of powerful counteroffensives aimed at pushing the Germans back and liberating occupied territories. The Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive. One of the most significant Soviet operations in 1943 was the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, which began in late August and continued into 1944. This series of coordinated assaults aimed to liberate the eastern bank of the Dnieper River and push towards the Carpathian Mountains. The offensive involved several key battles and was marked by intense fighting as the Soviets sought to reclaim strategic cities and regions. The liberation of Kiev on November 6, 1943, was a major milestone in this campaign. The city's capture was a significant blow to the German forces and boosted Soviet morale. The Red Army continued to advance, recapturing large swathes of territory and steadily pushing the Germans westward. The Mediterranean theater, the Italian campaign. Following the successful landings in Sicily and the initial invasions of mainland Italy, the Allies faced the challenging task of advancing through the rugged Italian terrain against well-entrenched German defenses. The Battle of Monte Cassino. One of the most grueling and prolonged battles of the Italian campaign was the Battle of Monte Cassino, which took place between January and May 1944. However, the groundwork for this battle was laid in late 1943. The town of Cassino, dominated by the ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, was a key point in the German Gustav Line, a formidable defensive barrier. The Allied advance towards Rome was stalled by the Gustav Line, and the rugged terrain made direct assaults costly and difficult. Throughout late 1943, the Allies made several attempts to breach the line, facing fierce resistance and suffering heavy casualties. The fighting around Monte Cassino was particularly intense, with both sides enduring significant losses. The Pacific Theater continued island hopping and key battles. In the Pacific, the Allied strategy of island hopping continued, targeting strategically important islands to establish bases for further operations against Japan. The Battle of Tarawa. The Battle of Tarawa, which began on November 20th, 1943, was one of the first major amphibious assaults in the Central Pacific. The island of Bidyo in the Tarawa Atoll was heavily fortified by the Japanese, with strong defenses including bunkers, pillboxes, and artillery. The U.S. Marines faced intense resistance as they landed on the beaches. The battle was marked by brutal close-quarters combat and high casualties on both sides. Despite the formidable defenses, the Marines managed to secure the island after 3 days of intense fighting. The victory at Tarawa demonstrated the challenges of amphibious assaults but also highlighted the determination and resilience of the American forces. The Bougainville Campaign. The Bougainville Campaign, which began in November 1943, aimed to establish airfields on the island to support further Allied operations in the Pacific. The landings faced stiff Japanese resistance, but the Allies gradually secured control of key areas. The establishment of airfields on Bougainville allowed the Allies to launch air raids on Japanese positions and support subsequent campaigns in the Solomon Islands and beyond. Strategic bombing campaigns. The Allied strategic bombing campaigns intensified in 1943, targeting key industrial and military sites in Germany and occupied Europe. The goal was to cripple the Axis war effort by destroying factories, transportation networks, and military installations. The bombing of Hamburg. One of the most devastating bombing raids of the war occurred in July 1943 during Operation Gemara, the bombing of Hamburg. The Royal Air Force, RAF, and the United States Army Air Forces, USAF, conducted a series of massive air raids on the city. The bombing resulted in a firestorm that caused widespread destruction and significant civilian casualties. The impact of the bombing raids on Hamburg was profound, severely damaging the city's industrial capacity and infrastructure. The psychological impact on the German population was also significant, as the reality of the war reached the home front in a devastating way. The home fronts sustained efforts and challenges. On the home fronts, the war effort continued to dominate daily life. In the United States, the war economy was in full swing, with factories operating around the clock to produce war materials. The American public was engaged in the war effort through rationing, war bonds, and volunteer activities. The significant contributions of women and minorities to the workforce were crucial to sustaining production. In Britain, the population continued to endure rationing and the threat of air raids. The government's propaganda efforts emphasized unity and determination, reinforcing the public's resolve to support the war effort. The British people remained resilient, contributing to the war through their work in factories, farms, and volunteer organizations. In the Soviet Union, the war effort was all-encompassing. The Soviet people faced immense hardships, but their determination to defeat the invaders fueled their relentless resistance. The relocation of industries to the east ensured that the Red Army had the resources needed to continue the fight. The sense of patriotism and the determination to defend the motherland unified the Soviet populace in their fight against the Germans. The Eastern Front, Soviet advances, and the Battle of Kursk. The Eastern Front continued to be a focal point of the war, with the Soviets launching a series of powerful offensives to reclaim their territory and push the Germans back. The Battle of Kursk. Following their defeat at Stalingrad, the Germans planned to regain the initiative with Operation Citadel, targeting the Soviet-held Kursk salient. The Battle of Kursk, which took place from July 5 to August 23, 1943, was one of the largest tank battles in history and a turning point on the Eastern Front. The Soviets, aware of German plans through intelligence and reconnaissance, had fortified their positions extensively. When the German offensive began, they faced well-prepared defenses. The initial German assault included a massive concentration of tanks and infantry aiming to encircle the Soviet forces. Despite initial gains, the German advance stalled due to the depth and strength of Soviet defenses. The Soviets launched powerful counteroffensives, including Operation Kutuzov and Operation Polkovodets-Rumiantsev, targeting the German flanks. These counterattacks forced the Germans into a defensive posture and eventually led to their retreat. The failure of the German offensive at Kursk marked the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front and a decisive victory for the Red Army. From this point on, the Soviets held the strategic initiative and began a series of relentless offensives that would push the Germans back towards Berlin. The Soviet counteroffensives. After the victory at Kursk, the Soviets launched several major offensives to reclaim occupied territories and weaken the German war effort. The Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, which began in August 1943 and continued into 1944, was a massive series of coordinated assaults aimed at liberating the eastern bank of the Dnieper River and advancing towards the Carpathian Mountains. The liberation of Kiev, on November 6, 1943, was a major milestone in this campaign. The city's capture dealt a significant blow to German forces and boosted Soviet morale. The Red Army continued to advance, recapturing large swathes of territory and steadily pushing the Germans westward. The Soviet strategy focused on exploiting weaknesses in German defenses using deep battle tactics to encircle and destroy enemy formations. The Mediterranean theater, the Italian campaign. In the Mediterranean, the Allies continued their efforts to secure Italy and weaken the Axis hold on Europe. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. The Allied invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, began on July 9 to 10, 1943. This was a massive amphibious and airborne operation involving American, British, and Canadian forces. The objective was to remove the Axis presence from the island, secure the Mediterranean sea lanes, and pave the way for the invasion of mainland Italy. The landings faced resistance, but the Allies, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower and British General Bernard Montgomery, managed to secure a foothold. Over the next few weeks, they pushed inland, overcoming the German and Italian defenders. By August 17, 1943, the island was fully in Allied hands. The success of Operation Husky had significant strategic implications, forcing Italy to reconsider its position in the war. The fall of Mussolini and the invasion of Italy. The invasion of Sicily and the growing threat of an Allied invasion of mainland Italy led to political upheaval in Italy. On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini was arrested after a coup d'état, and King Victor Emmanuel III appointed Marshal Pietro Badoglio as the new prime minister. Badoglio began secret negotiations with the Allies for an armistice. On September 3, 1943, the same day that Allied forces landed on the Italian mainland at Salerno, Operation Avalanche, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies. The announcement of the armistice on September 8 led to chaos and confusion. German forces quickly moved to disarm Italian troops and occupy key positions, including Rome. The Allies faced stiff German resistance as they advanced northward. The battles for control of southern Italy were intense, with key engagements at Salerno, Naples, and Monte Cassino. The rugged terrain and well-fortified German positions made the Allied advance slow and costly, but by the end of 1943, the Allies had made significant progress, liberating parts of southern Italy. The Pacific Theater, the Island Hopping Campaign. In the Pacific, the Allied strategy of island hopping continued, targeting strategically important islands to establish bases for further advances towards Japan. The New Georgia Campaign. Following the hard-fought victory at Guadalcanal, the Allies targeted the New Georgia group of islands. The New Georgia Campaign, which began in June 1943, aimed to capture the island and neutralize the Japanese airfield at Munda. The campaign involved intense jungle warfare and faced fierce Japanese resistance. Despite the challenges, the Allies secured New Georgia by August, gaining a crucial foothold in the Solomon Islands. The Bougainville Campaign. The Bougainville Campaign began in November 1943 with the objective of establishing airfields on the island to support further Allied operations in the Pacific. The landings faced heavy Japanese resistance, but the Allies gradually secured control of key areas. The establishment of airfields on Bougainville allowed the Allies to launch air raids on Japanese positions and support subsequent campaigns in the Solomon Islands and beyond. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns. The Allies also focused on the Central Pacific, with significant operations in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. The Battle of Tarawa, part of the Gilbert Islands campaign, took place in November 1943. The heavily fortified Japanese defenses on the small island of Betio in the Tarawa Atoll led to intense and bloody fighting. Despite high casualties, the Allies captured the island, demonstrating the brutal nature of Pacific warfare. Following Tarawa, the Allies launched the Marshall Islands Campaign in early 1944, targeting key atolls such as Kwajalein and Eniwetok. These operations aimed to establish bases for further advances towards the Mariana Islands and ultimately Japan. The home fronts sustained efforts and challenges. On the home fronts, the war effort continued to dominate daily life. In the United States, the war economy was in full swing, with factories operating around the clock to produce war materials. The American public was engaged in the war effort through rationing, war bonds, and volunteer activities. The significant contributions of women and minorities to the workforce were crucial to sustaining production. In Britain, the population continued to endure rationing and the threat of air raids. The government's propaganda efforts emphasized unity and determination, reinforcing the public's resolve to support the war effort. The British people remained resilient, contributing to the war through their work in factories, farms, and volunteer organizations. In the Soviet Union, the war effort was all-encompassing. The Soviet people faced immense hardships, but their determination to defeat the invaders fueled their relentless resistance. The relocation of industries to the east ensured that the Red Army had the resources needed to continue the fight. The sense of patriotism and the determination to defend the motherland unified the Soviet populace in their fight against the Germans. Strategic bombing campaigns. The Allied strategic bombing campaigns intensified in 1943, targeting key industrial and military sites in Germany and occupied Europe. The goal was to cripple the Axis war effort by destroying factories, transportation networks, and military installations. The bombing of Hamburg. One of the most devastating bombing raids of the war occurred in July 1943 during Operation Gemara, the bombing of Hamburg. The Royal Air Force, RAF, and the United States Army Air Forces, USAF, conducted a series of massive air raids on the city. The bombing resulted in a firestorm that caused widespread destruction and significant civilian casualties. The impact of the bombing raids on Hamburg was profound, severely damaging the city's industrial capacity and infrastructure. The psychological impact on the German population was also significant, as the reality of the war reached the home front in a devastating way. The Battle of the Ruhr. In early 1943, the Allies launched the Battle of the Ruhr, a strategic bombing campaign aimed at crippling Germany's industrial heartland. The Ruhr Valley was a key center for German industry, and its factories produced a significant portion of the war material for the Wehrmacht. The RAF and USAF conducted sustained bombing raids on cities such as Essen, Dortmund, and Duisburg, targeting factories, railways, and other industrial infrastructure. The campaign inflicted severe damage on German industry, disrupting production and supply lines. It also forced the Germans to divert resources to defend against the bombing raids, weakening their overall war effort. The partisan movements and resistance. Throughout 1943, partisan movements and resistance groups across Europe intensified their efforts against the Axis occupation. In occupied countries such as France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland, resistance fighters conducted sabotage operations, gathered intelligence for the Allies, and engaged in guerrilla warfare against Axis forces. In Yugoslavia, the partisan movement led by Josip Broz Tito gained significant strength and conducted effective operations against the German and Italian occupiers. The partisans established liberated territories and disrupted Axis supply lines, playing a crucial role in the broader Allied effort. In France, the French resistance, composed of various groups, including communists, Gaullists, and other anti-fascist factions, continued to carry out sabotage operations and assist Allied intelligence. The resistance fighters provided valuable information to the Allies, helping to prepare for the eventual liberation of France. The Eastern Front continued Soviet advances. As 1943 progressed, the Soviet Union capitalized on their victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, launching a series of offensives aimed at reclaiming territory and further weakening the German Wehrmacht. The Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive. The Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, which began in late August and continued into early 1944, was one of the largest Soviet operations of the war. This offensive involved multiple coordinated assaults aimed at liberating the eastern bank of the Dnieper River and advancing towards the Carpathian Mountains. The offensive consisted of several key battles, including the Battle of the Dnieper. Soviet forces employed deep battle tactics, which involved breaking through enemy lines with coordinated attacks and then exploiting these breaches to encircle and destroy German formations. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The capture of Kiev, on November 6, 1943, was a significant milestone in the offensive. The liberation of this major city dealt a blow to German morale and demonstrated the growing strength and effectiveness of the Red Army. Following the capture of Kiev, Soviet forces continued their advance, liberating more territories and pushing the Germans further west. The Italian campaign, Allied struggles in Italy. Following the successful invasion of Sicily and the mainland landings, the Allies faced the challenging task of advancing through Italy's rugged terrain and overcoming well-entrenched German defenses. The Battle of Monte Cassino. The Battle of Monte Cassino, fought between January and May 1944, was a series of 4 assaults by the Allies against the Winter Line, a formidable German defensive line anchored by the historic monastery of Monte Cassino. However, the groundwork for this battle was laid in late 1943. The first assault on Monte Cassino began on January 17, 1944, but fierce German resistance and difficult terrain halted the Allied advance. The historic monastery itself became a focal point of the battle, and on February 15th, the Allies controversially bombed the monastery, believing it was being used as a German observation post. The bombing reduced the monastery to rubble, but the Germans turned the ruins into a strong defensive position. Subsequent assaults in February and March also failed to break through the German defenses, resulting in heavy casualties for the Allies. It wasn't until the fourth and final assault in May, involving a coordinated attack by multiple Allied forces, that the Gustav Line was finally breached, leading to the capture of Monte Cassino and the eventual advance towards Rome. The Pacific Theater, the island hopping campaign intensifies. In the Pacific, the Allied strategy of island hopping continued, targeting strategically important islands to establish bases for further advances towards Japan. The Bougainville Campaign. The Bougainville Campaign, which began in November 1943, continued into 1944. The Allies aimed to establish airfields on the island to support further operations in the Pacific. The initial landings faced heavy Japanese resistance, but the Allies gradually secured control of key areas. The establishment of airfields on Bougainville allowed the Allies to launch air raids on Japanese positions and support subsequent campaigns in the Solomon Islands and beyond. The airfields played a crucial role in isolating Japanese forces and disrupting their supply lines. The Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns. The Allies also focused on the Central Pacific, with significant operations in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. The Battle of Tarawa, part of the Gilbert Islands campaign, took place in November 1943. The heavily fortified Japanese defenses on the small island of Bidio in the Tarawa Atoll led to intense and bloody fighting. Despite high casualties, the Allies captured the island, demonstrating the brutal nature of Pacific warfare. Following Tarawa, the Allies launched the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944, targeting key atolls such as Kwajalein and Eniwetok. These operations aimed to establish bases for further advances towards the Mariana Islands and ultimately Japan. Strategic bombing campaigns. The Allied strategic bombing campaigns intensified in 1943, targeting key industrial and military sites in Germany and occupied Europe. The goal was to cripple the Axis war effort by destroying factories, transportation networks, and military installations. The bombing of Hamburg. One of the most devastating bombing raids of the war occurred in July 1943 during Operation Gemara, the bombing of Hamburg. The Royal Air Force, RAF, and the United States Army Air Forces, USAF, conducted a series of massive air raids on the city. The bombing resulted in a firestorm that caused widespread destruction and significant civilian casualties. The impact of the bombing raids on Hamburg was profound, severely damaging the city's industrial capacity and infrastructure. The psychological impact on the German population was also significant, as the reality of the war reached the home front in a devastating way. The Battle of the Ruhr. In early 1943, the Allies launched the Battle of the Ruhr, a strategic bombing campaign aimed at crippling Germany's industrial heartland. The Ruhr Valley was a key center for German industry, and its factories produced a significant portion of the war material for the Wehrmacht. The RAF and USAF conducted sustained bombing raids on cities such as Essen, Dortmund, and Duisburg, targeting factories, railways, and other industrial infrastructure. The campaign inflicted severe damage on German industry, disrupting production and supply lines. It also forced the Germans to divert resources to defend against the bombing raids, weakening their overall war effort. The partisan movements and resistance. Throughout 1943, partisan movements and resistance groups across Europe intensified their efforts against the Axis occupation. In occupied countries such as France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland, resistance fighters conducted sabotage operations, gathered intelligence for the Allies, and engaged in guerrilla warfare against Axis forces. In Yugoslavia, the partisan movement led by Josip Broz Tito gained significant strength and conducted effective operations against the German and Italian occupiers. The partisans established liberated territories and disrupted Axis supply lines, playing a crucial role in the broader Allied effort. In France, the French resistance, composed of various groups, including communists, Gaullists, and other anti-fascist factions, continued to carry out sabotage operations and assist Allied intelligence. The resistance fighters provided valuable information to the Allies, helping to prepare for the eventual liberation of France. Scientific and technological advances. 1943 also saw significant scientific and technological advances that would impact the course of the war. In the United States, the Manhattan Project, the secret effort to develop an atomic bomb, was making progress. Scientists, including many who had fled from Nazi-occupied Europe, were working tirelessly to unlock the secrets of nuclear fission. This project would eventually lead to a new and devastating weapon that would change the nature of warfare. In the field of radar technology, both the Allies and the Axis made significant improvements. Radar became a crucial tool for detecting enemy aircraft and ships, providing a strategic advantage in both the Pacific and European theaters. The development of more sophisticated radar systems helped the Allies to better defend against air raids and coordinate their own offensive operations. The home fronts sustained efforts and challenges. On the home fronts, the war effort continued to dominate daily life. In the United States, the war economy was in full swing, with factories operating around the clock to produce war materials. The American public was engaged in the war effort through rationing, war bonds, and volunteer activities. The significant contributions of women and minorities to the workforce were crucial to sustaining production. In Britain, the population continued to endure rationing and the threat of air raids. The government's propaganda efforts emphasized unity and determination, reinforcing the public's resolve to support the war effort. The British people remained resilient, contributing to the war through their work in factories, farms, and volunteer organizations. In the Soviet Union, the war effort was all-encompassing. The Soviet people faced immense hardships, but their determination to defeat the invaders fueled their relentless resistance. The relocation of industries to the east ensured that the Red Army had the resources needed to continue the fight. The sense of patriotism and the determination to defend the motherland unified the Soviet populace in their fight against the Germans. 1944, the Allies pushed forward. 1944 was a pivotal year in World War II, marked by significant Allied offensives and the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. Major operations took place across Europe and the Pacific, leading to crucial turning points in the conflict. The Eastern Front, Soviet advances. As 1944 began, the Soviet Union was determined to continue their momentum from the previous year's victories. They launched a series of powerful offensives to reclaim occupied territories and push the Germans back. The Leningrad-Novgorod Offensive. In January 1944, the Red Army launched the Leningrad-Novgorod Offensive, breaking the nearly 900-day siege of Leningrad. The city's liberation was not only a strategic victory, but also a significant morale booster for the Soviet Union. The siege had caused immense suffering, with over 1 million civilians dying from starvation, cold, and bombardment. The offensive pushed German forces away from the region, marking a turning point on the Eastern Front. The operation began with a massive artillery barrage, followed by coordinated infantry and armored assaults. Soviet forces employed deep battle tactics, penetrating the German defenses and encircling key positions. The Germans, caught off guard by the intensity and scale of the assault, were forced to retreat. By the end of January, the Soviets had not only lifted the siege but also recaptured key cities and towns, securing vital supply routes and stabilizing the front lines. The Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive. Following the success at Leningrad, the Soviets launched the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, one of the largest and most complex operations of the war. This offensive, which lasted from late January to early April, aimed to liberate the right bank of Ukraine and advance towards the Carpathian Mountains. The operation involved several key battles and was marked by intense fighting and significant strategic maneuvers. One of the major objectives was the recapture of Kiev, which had been liberated in November 1943. The Soviets continued their push westward, facing stiff German resistance. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Soviet forces used a combination of frontal assaults and flanking maneuvers to break through German defenses and encircle enemy units. The offensive saw the use of vast amounts of artillery and air support, with Soviet bombers and ground attack aircraft playing crucial roles in softening enemy positions before ground assaults. The harsh winter conditions added to the difficulties, but the Red Army's determination and superior numbers eventually prevailed. By April, the Soviets had achieved significant gains, liberating much of the right bank Ukraine and advancing into the foothills of the Carpathians. This offensive not only weakened the German army group south, but also disrupted German supply lines and command structures, paving the way for further Soviet advances. The Western Front, D-Day, and the liberation of France. While the Soviets were making gains in the east, the Western Allies were preparing for a major invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe, culminating in Operation Overlord. D-Day, the Normandy invasion. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. The planning for Operation Overlord had been extensive, involving detailed coordination between American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces. The landings took place across 5 beachheads: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The landings were preceded by a massive aerial and naval bombardment aimed at softening German defenses. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were dropped behind enemy lines to capture key bridges and roadways, disrupting German communications and reinforcements. The American forces faced the toughest resistance at Omaha Beach, where the terrain and strong German fortifications led to high casualties. Despite the heavy losses, the determination and bravery of the troops enabled them to secure the beachhead. By the end of the day, over 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy, establishing a crucial foothold in Western Europe. The Battle of Normandy. The Battle of Normandy, which lasted from June to August 1944, involved intense and brutal fighting as the Allies sought to break out from the beachheads and advance into the French countryside. The bocage, a dense network of hedgerows and small fields, provided excellent defensive positions for the Germans and made the Allied advance slow and costly. One of the key battles during this period was the Battle of Caen. The city of Caen was a major objective for the British and Canadian forces, but it was heavily defended by German troops, including elements of the elite SS Panzer divisions. The battle saw extensive urban combat and heavy bombing, leading to significant destruction of the city. After several weeks of intense fighting, Caen was finally liberated in mid-July. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, was a pivotal moment in the Normandy campaign. Led by American forces, the operation aimed to break through the German lines and enable a rapid advance across France. The use of concentrated artillery barrages and air support helped create a breakthrough, allowing armored divisions to exploit the breach and encircle German forces. The success of Operation Cobra led to the rapid liberation of much of northern France and paved the way for the eventual liberation of Paris. The liberation of Paris. Following the success of Operation Cobra, the Allies advanced rapidly towards Paris. French resistance fighters, who had been active throughout the occupation, launched uprisings within the city, further destabilizing the German hold. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated by the French 2nd Armored Division and American forces. The liberation of Paris was a significant symbolic victory for the Allies and a major boost to French morale. The Italian campaign, advances and challenges. In Italy, the Allies continued their push northward, facing tough German resistance and challenging terrain. The Battle of Monte Cassino. The Battle of Monte Cassino, which began in January 1944, was a series of 4 assaults by the Allies against the German-held Gustav Line. The Gustav Line was a formidable defensive line that the Germans had constructed across the Italian peninsula, anchored by the historic monastery at Monte Cassino. The mountainous terrain and well-fortified positions made the Gustav Line a significant obstacle to the Allied advance. The first assault on Monte Cassino began on January 17, 1944. Allied forces, including British, American, and Free French troops, faced fierce German resistance. The battle saw intense fighting in difficult terrain, with the Allies making only limited progress. Despite the challenges, they continued to push forward, determined to break through the Gustav Line. On February 15, 1944, the Allies controversially bombed the ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, believing that it was being used by German forces as an observation post. The bombing reduced the monastery to rubble, but the Germans turned the ruins into a strong defensive position. The second and third assaults in February and March also failed to break through the German defenses, resulting in heavy casualties for the Allies. It wasn't until the fourth and final assault, which began in mid-May 1944, that the Allies finally managed to breach the Gustav Line. This final assault involved a massive coordinated attack by British, American, Polish, and French forces. After intense fighting, they succeeded in capturing Monte Cassino and breaking through the German defenses. The fall of Monte Cassino opened the way for the Allied advance towards Rome. The liberation of Rome. The capture of Rome was a significant milestone in the Italian campaign. On June 4, 1944, Allied forces entered the city, liberating it from German control. The fall of Rome was a major strategic and symbolic victory for the Allies, marking the first Axis capital to be liberated. However, the campaign in Italy was far from over, as the Allies faced further resistance from German forces entrenched in the northern part of the country. The Gothic Line. Following the capture of Rome, the Allies encountered the Gothic Line, another formidable German defensive position running across the Apennine Mountains. The advance through northern Italy was slow and difficult, with rugged terrain and well-fortified positions favoring the defenders. The fighting continued into 1945, with the Allies gradually pushing the Germans back. The Pacific Theater, island hopping, and major battles. In the Pacific, the Allies continued their strategy of island hopping, targeting key Japanese-held islands to establish bases for further advances towards Japan. The Battle of Saipan. The Battle of Saipan, fought from June 15 to July 9, 1944, was a critical battle in the Mariana Islands. The island was heavily defended by Japanese forces, and the battle involved intense and bloody fighting. The capture of Saipan allowed the Allies to build airfields within bomber range of the Japanese home islands, significantly increasing the pressure on Japan. The battle began with a massive naval bombardment, followed by amphibious landings. The American forces faced fierce resistance from the entrenched Japanese defenders, who used the island's rugged terrain to their advantage. The fighting was brutal, with heavy casualties on both sides. After weeks of intense combat, the Allies secured Saipan, dealing a significant blow to Japanese defensive capabilities in the Pacific. The defeat at Saipan had significant psychological impacts. It contributed to the resignation of Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, signaling a major shift in Japanese political leadership. The loss of Saipan also meant that the Japanese home islands were now within range of American B-29 bombers, which began launching devastating air raids on Japanese cities. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to 26, 1944, was one of the largest naval battles in history. The battle took place in the waters around the Philippine island of Leyte and involved massive fleets from both the Allies and Japan. The Japanese aimed to repel the American invasion of the Philippines and regain control of the region. The battle consisted of several major engagements, including the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, the Battle of Surigao Strait, and the Battle off Samar. The Allies, with their superior naval power and effective use of aircraft carriers, achieved a decisive victory. The Japanese fleet suffered devastating losses, including the sinking of several aircraft carriers and battleships. The victory of Leyte Gulf ensured Allied control of the Philippines and significantly weakened the Japanese Navy, which was no longer able to conduct major offensive operations. The recapture of the Philippines cut off Japanese access to crucial resources and further isolated Japan. Strategic bombing and the war in the air. The strategic bombing campaigns continued to intensify in 1944, targeting key industrial and military sites in Germany and occupied Europe. The bombing of Germany. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany aimed to cripple its industrial capacity and weaken its ability to continue the war. The RAF and USAF conducted sustained bombing raids on cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden, targeting factories, railways, and other critical infrastructure. The bombing campaigns inflicted severe damage on German industry, disrupting production and supply lines. The raids also had a significant psychological impact on the German population, contributing to a decline in morale and support for the war. The destruction caused by the bombings created immense challenges for the German war effort, as they struggled to repair damaged facilities and maintain production. The home fronts sustained efforts and challenges. On the home fronts, the war effort continued to dominate daily life. In the United States, the war economy was in full swing, with factories operating around the clock to produce war materials. The American public was engaged in the war effort through rationing, war bonds, and volunteer activities. The significant contributions of women and minorities to the workforce were crucial to sustaining production. In Britain, the population continued to endure rationing and the threat of air raids. The government's propaganda efforts emphasized unity and determination, reinforcing the public's resolve to support the war effort. The British people remained resilient, contributing to the war through their work in factories, farms, and volunteer organizations. In the Soviet Union, the war effort was all-encompassing. The Soviet people faced immense hardships, but their determination to defeat the invaders fueled their relentless resistance. The relocation of industries to the east ensured that the Red Army had the resources needed to continue the fight. The sense of patriotism and the determination to defend the motherland unified the Soviet populace in their fight against the Germans. Resistance movements and partisans. Throughout 1944, resistance movements and partisan groups across Europe intensified their efforts against the Axis occupation. In occupied countries such as France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland, resistance fighters conducted sabotage operations, gathered intelligence for the Allies, and engaged in guerrilla warfare against Axis forces. In Yugoslavia, the partisan movement led by Josip Broz Tito gained significant strength and conducted effective operations against the German and Italian occupiers. The partisans established liberated territories and disrupted Axis supply lines, playing a crucial role in the broader Allied effort. In France, the French resistance, composed of various groups, including communists, Gaullists, and other anti-fascist factions, continued to carry out sabotage operations and assist Allied intelligence. The resistance fighters provided valuable information to the Allies, helping to prepare for the eventual liberation of France. The Western Front, the Battle of the Bulge. As the Allies advanced through France and into Belgium, the Germans planned a counteroffensive to push back the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. This counteroffensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, began on December 16, 1944. The German offensive. The German plan, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, aimed to surprise the Allies by attacking through the Ardennes forest, a region that had been lightly defended. The Germans massed over 200,000 troops and 1,000 tanks for the offensive, achieving complete surprise. The initial assault created a bulge in the Allied front lines, leading to intense and chaotic fighting. The Siege of Bastogne. One of the key locations during the Battle of the Bulge was the town of Bastogne, which was held by the 101st Airborne Division. The town was strategically important as it was a major road junction. The Germans encircled Bastogne, and the defenders faced severe shortages of supplies and ammunition. Despite the harsh winter conditions and relentless German attacks, the American forces held their ground. On December 22, 1944, the Germans issued a demand for surrender to the encircled American forces. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander, famously replied with a single word, "Nuts." This defiant response became a symbol of American resolve. The Allied counteroffensive. The weather conditions, which had initially favored the Germans by grounding Allied air support, began to improve by late December. This allowed the Allies to launch a counteroffensive with the support of airstrikes and reinforcements. General George S. Patton's Third Army played a crucial role in relieving Bastogne on December 26, breaking the German siege. The fighting continued into January 1945, with the Allies gradually pushing the Germans back. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II, with significant casualties on both sides. However, the German offensive ultimately failed, depleting their reserves and weakening their ability to defend against the impending Allied advance into Germany. The Pacific Theater continued island hopping and major battles. In the Pacific, the Allies continued their strategy of island hopping, targeting key Japanese-held islands to establish bases for further advances towards Japan. The Battle of Peleliu. The Battle of Peleliu, fought from September to November 1944, was one of the most intense and controversial battles in the Pacific War. The island of Peleliu was part of the Palau Islands and was heavily fortified by the Japanese. The battle was intended to secure an airfield to support future operations, but it turned into a brutal and costly campaign. The American forces faced fierce resistance from the well-entrenched Japanese defenders, who used the island's rugged terrain and extensive network of caves and bunkers to their advantage. The fighting was characterized by intense close-quarters combat, with heavy casualties on both sides. Despite the high cost, the Americans eventually secured the island, but the strategic value of Peleliu was later questioned given the subsequent operations in the Philippines. The Philippines campaign, the Battle of Leyte. Following the success of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Allies continued their campaign to liberate the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte, which began in October 1944, saw American forces land on the island of Leyte and engage in fierce fighting to dislodge the Japanese defenders. General Douglas MacArthur, fulfilling his famous promise to return to the Philippines, led the American forces. The campaign involved not only land battles but also significant naval and air operations. The Japanese forces, determined to hold the Philippines, fought tenaciously, but the overwhelming Allied firepower and coordination gradually turned the tide. By the end of 1944, the Allies had secured significant portions of Leyte, paving the way for further operations to liberate the rest of the Philippines. The campaign disrupted Japanese supply lines and weakened their ability to defend the remaining occupied territories in Southeast Asia. Strategic bombing and the war in the air. The strategic bombing campaigns continued to intensify in 1944, targeting key industrial and military sites in Germany and occupied Europe. The bombing of Germany. The Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany aimed to cripple its industrial capacity and weaken its ability to continue the war. The RAF and USAF conducted sustained bombing raids on cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden, targeting factories, railways, and other critical infrastructure. The bombing campaigns inflicted severe damage on German industry, disrupting production and supply lines. The raids also had a significant psychological impact on the German population, contributing to a decline in morale and support for the war. The destruction caused by the bombings created immense challenges for the German war effort as they struggled to repair damaged facilities and maintain production. Resistance movements and partisans. Throughout 1944, resistance movements and partisan groups across Europe intensified their efforts against the Axis occupation. In occupied countries such as France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland, resistance fighters conducted sabotage operations, gathered intelligence for the Allies, and engaged in guerrilla warfare against Axis forces. The French resistance. In France, the French resistance played a crucial role in supporting the Allied invasion of Normandy and the subsequent liberation of France. Resistance fighters carried out sabotage operations, disrupted German supply lines, and provided valuable intelligence to the Allies. Their efforts were instrumental in the success of the D-Day landings and the rapid advance across France. The Yugoslav partisans. In Yugoslavia, the partisan movement led by Josip Broz Tito gained significant strength and conducted effective operations against the German and Italian occupiers. The partisans established liberated territories and disrupted Axis supply lines, playing a crucial role in the broader Allied effort. Tito's forces received support from the Allies, including supplies and air support, which helped them maintain their operations and increase their impact on the Axis forces. The Polish resistance. In Poland, the resistance movement, known as the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, was one of the largest and most organized resistance groups in occupied Europe. The Home Army carried out sabotage operations, gathered intelligence, and prepared for a national uprising against the German occupiers. The Warsaw Uprising, which began on August 1, 1944, was a major effort by the Polish resistance to liberate the city from German control. Despite initial successes, the uprising was brutally suppressed by the Germans, resulting in significant civilian casualties and the destruction of much of Warsaw. 1945, the end of World War II. 1945 was the final year of World War II, marked by significant Allied offensives that led to the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. This year saw some of the most intense and decisive battles of the war, as well as the beginning of post-war reconstruction. The Eastern Front, the fall of Berlin. The Soviet Union continued its relentless push westward, culminating in the capture of Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. The Vistula-Oder Offensive. In January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder Offensive, one of the largest and fastest advances of the war. The offensive began with a massive artillery barrage, followed by the rapid advance of Soviet troops across Poland. The operation was meticulously planned, with Soviet forces breaking through German defenses and advancing over 300 miles in less than a month. Key cities, including Warsaw, were liberated, and Soviet troops reached the Oder River, just 40 miles from Berlin. The success of the Vistula-Oder offensive demonstrated the overwhelming strength of the Red Army and significantly weakened the German forces. The rapid advance also disrupted German supply lines and command structures, setting the stage for the final assault on Berlin. The Battle of Berlin. The Battle of Berlin was the final major offensive of the European theater. It began on April 16, 1945, with the Soviet forces launching a massive assault on the German capital from multiple directions. The Red Army encircled the city, trapping hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians. The fighting in Berlin was intense and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Soviet troops fought street by street and building by building, facing fierce resistance from German defenders, including the remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS units, and even Hitler Youth members. Despite the desperate German defense, the overwhelming numbers and firepower of the Soviet forces gradually overwhelmed the defenders. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops closed in on his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. His death marked the effective end of Nazi Germany. On May 2nd, 1945, the remaining German forces in Berlin surrendered to the Red Army. The fall of Berlin was a decisive moment in the war, leading to the unconditional surrender of Germany. The German surrender. Following the fall of Berlin, German forces across Europe began to surrender. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Allied headquarters in Reims, France. The surrender took effect on May 8, 1945, a day celebrated as Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was officially over, and the Allied powers began the process of occupying and rebuilding Germany. The Western Front, the Allied advance into Germany. On the Western Front, the Allied forces, comprising American, British, Canadian, and French troops, continued their advance into Germany, liberating occupied territories and capturing key cities. The Battle of the Bulge. The year began with the conclusion of the Battle of the Bulge, which had started in December 1944. The German counteroffensive had created a bulge in the Allied lines, but by January 1945, the Allies had pushed the Germans back, regaining lost territory and inflicting heavy casualties on the German forces. The failure of the offensive depleted German resources and morale, making it clear that the end of the war in Europe was near. Crossing the Rhine. In March 1945, the Allies launched Operation Plunder, a coordinated assault to cross the Rhine River, a major natural barrier protecting Germany's heartland. American forces, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, successfully crossed the Rhine at Remagen, capturing the Ludendorff Bridge intact. This unexpected success allowed Allied forces to rapidly advance into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. The British and Canadian forces crossed the Rhine further north, and together with American troops, they encircled and captured hundreds of thousands of German soldiers in the Ruhr pocket. The swift and successful crossing of the Rhine marked a significant milestone in the Allied advance, paving the way for the final push into Germany. The liberation of concentration camps. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, they began to liberate concentration camps, revealing the full extent of the Holocaust. The liberation of camps such as Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen exposed the horrific atrocities committed by the Nazis, with thousands of emaciated survivors and evidence of mass murder. The discovery of these camps shocked the world and underscored the moral imperative of the Allied victory. The Pacific Theater, the final campaigns. While the war in Europe was drawing to a close, the conflict in the Pacific continued with intense and decisive battles as the Allies sought to defeat Imperial Japan. The Battle of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima, fought from February 19 to March 26, 1945, was one of the most iconic and brutal battles of the Pacific War. The island of Iwo Jima was strategically important for its airfields, which could be used to support bombing raids on Japan and provide emergency landing sites for damaged bombers. The battle began with a massive naval and air bombardment, followed by the amphibious landing of U.S. Marines. The Japanese defenders, deeply entrenched in a network of tunnels and bunkers, fought tenaciously. The fighting was characterized by intense close-quarters combat, with heavy casualties on both sides. One of the most famous moments of the battle was the raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi, captured in an iconic photograph by Joe Rosenthal. Despite the symbolic victory, the fighting continued for several weeks, with the Marines gradually securing the island at great cost. The capture of Iwo Jima provided a crucial base for the Allies and brought them closer to the Japanese home islands. The Battle of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa, fought from April 1 to June 22, 1945, was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War and one of the bloodiest battles of the entire conflict. Okinawa was seen as a critical stepping stone for a potential invasion of Japan, and both sides recognized its strategic importance. The battle began with a massive naval bombardment and the landing of U.S. Army and Marine forces. The Japanese defenders, adopting a strategy of attrition, fortified the island's rugged terrain and used kamikaze attacks to inflict maximum casualties on the invading forces. The fighting was fierce and protracted, with heavy losses on both sides. The Allies faced well-coordinated Japanese defenses, including caves, tunnels, and strong points. Despite the challenges, American forces steadily advanced, capturing key positions and inflicting severe losses on the Japanese. The battle ended with the capture of the island, but at a tremendous cost, with thousands of soldiers and civilians killed. The bombing of Japan. As the Allies captured strategic islands in the Pacific, they began a sustained bombing campaign against Japan. The use of B-29 Superfortress bombers allowed the United States to reach the Japanese home islands from bases in the Marianas, such as Saipan and Tinian. Firebombing of Tokyo. One of the most devastating bombing raids took place on the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, when the U.S. launched a massive firebombing raid on Tokyo. The raid, known as Operation Meeting House, involved over 300 B-29 bombers dropping incendiary bombs on the densely populated urban areas of Tokyo. The resulting firestorm destroyed large portions of the city, killing an estimated 100,000 civilians and leaving over 1 million people homeless. The destruction of Tokyo demonstrated the devastating power of the bombing campaign and the vulnerability of Japanese cities. Continued bombing campaign. The firebombing of Tokyo was followed by similar raids on other major Japanese cities, including Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe. The bombing campaign aimed to destroy Japan's industrial capacity, disrupt transportation networks, and break civilian morale. By mid-1945, many Japanese cities lay in ruins, and the country's ability to sustain the war effort was severely weakened. The Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. While conventional bombing raids inflicted massive destruction, the United States was also developing a new and more powerful weapon, the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project, a secret research and development project, had been working since 1942 to harness the power of nuclear fission. The Trinity Test. On July 16, 1945, the first successful test of an atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, took place in the New Mexico desert. The test demonstrated the unprecedented destructive power of the bomb, confirming its potential as a weapon of war. Following the successful test, the United States prepared to use atomic bombs against Japan in an effort to force a swift end to the war. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, exploded with a force of approximately 15 kilotons of TNT, causing massive destruction and killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly, with tens of thousands more dying from radiation sickness and injuries in the following weeks and months. Despite the devastation, the Japanese government did not immediately surrender. On August 9, 1945, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. The bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was even more powerful, with an explosive yield of about 21 kilotons. The bombing of Nagasaki killed an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people instantly, with many more dying from the aftereffects. The immense destruction and loss of life caused by the atomic bombings, coupled with the Soviet declaration of war against Japan and their invasion of Manchuria, led the Japanese government to finally accept the inevitable. Japanese surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, marking the end of World War II. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Representatives of the Japanese government signed the instrument of surrender, officially ending the war. This day is celebrated as Victory over Japan, VJ Day. The aftermath of World War II. The end of World War II brought significant changes to the global political landscape and set the stage for the post-war order. Occupation and reconstruction of Germany. Following Germany's surrender, the Allies divided the country into 4 occupation zones, each administered by one of the Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. Berlin, the capital, was similarly divided. The goal of the occupation was to demilitarize, denazify, and democratize Germany, ensuring that it could never again pose a threat to world peace. The Nuremberg trials, held from 1945 to 1946, prosecuted key Nazi leaders for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other offenses. The trials were a landmark in the development of international law and set a precedent for the prosecution of war crimes. Reconstruction efforts focused on rebuilding Germany's devastated infrastructure and economy. The Marshall Plan, initiated by the United States in 1947, provided significant financial aid to help rebuild Europe, including Germany. The plan aimed to promote economic recovery, political stability, and prevent the spread of communism. Occupation and reconstruction of Japan. In Japan, the Allied occupation was led by General Douglas MacArthur. The goals of the occupation included demilitarizing Japan, dismantling its war industries, and establishing a democratic government. The Allies also sought to prosecute those responsible for war crimes, leading to the Tokyo War Crimes Trials. One of the most significant reforms was the adoption of a new constitution in 1947, which established a parliamentary democracy, guaranteed civil liberties, and renounced war as a means of resolving international disputes. The economic reconstruction of Japan was supported by U.S. financial aid and policies aimed at revitalizing industry and trade. These efforts laid the foundation for Japan's rapid post-war economic growth. The formation of the United Nations. The devastation of World War II underscored the need for a new international organization to promote peace and prevent future conflicts. In April 1945, representatives from 50 countries met in San Francisco to draft the United Nations Charter. The UN Charter was signed on June 26, 1945, and the United Nations officially came into existence on October 24, 1945. The United Nations aimed to provide a forum for resolving international disputes, promoting human rights, and fostering economic and social development. The establishment of the UN marked a significant step towards a more cooperative and multilateral approach to global governance. The beginning of the Cold War. The end of World War II also marked the beginning of a new geopolitical conflict, the Cold War. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly unraveled as ideological differences and mutual distrust led to increasing tensions. The division of Germany and the differing visions for its future became a focal point of the emerging Cold War. The Soviet Union established communist governments in Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone of satellite states, while the United States and its allies promoted democratic governance and economic recovery in Western Europe. The Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill in a 1946 speech, symbolized the ideological and physical division between the communist East and the capitalist West. The Cold War would dominate global politics for the next 4 decades, leading to numerous conflicts, proxy wars, and an arms race between the superpowers. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the events of World War II. I hope you found this exploration both informative and relaxing. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel for more historical narratives and ASMR content. Your support means a lot and helps me create more videos like this one. If there are any specific topics or events you would like me to cover in future videos, please let me know in the comments below. I love hearing your suggestions and feedback. Thank you again for watching, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you soon.